My name is Rosalind Pruitt. I am 46 years old. 3 days after my mother forced my brother's 2 young sons into my spare bedroom for what she called a temporary break, a state social worker called my clinic. She did not call to check on the boys. She called to confirm the permanent kinship placement my family had filed. They forged my signature to dump the children, all while keeping a wrongful death settlement to fund my brother's luxury lifestyle. When I placed the boys' medical files on the dining room table at our next Sunday dinner, my father's face turned the color of ash. Before we get into how I dismantled my family's pristine reputation, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Blueberry Revenge, but only if this story truly resonates with you, and drop your age and location in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now let me take you back to a sweltering Friday evening in Fort Smith, Arkansas. The kind of humid heat that sticks to your skin the moment you step out of the car. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the family practice clinic. My feet ached. My scrub smelled like medical-grade sanitizer. When I pulled into my driveway, a gleaming lifted Ford truck was idling in front of my porch. My mother Brenda stood on the front steps. Next to her stood my brother Travis, and huddled behind them were my 2 nephews, 8-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Toby. The boys were clutching black plastic kitchen trash bags. Through the thin plastic, I could see the outline of mismatched clothes and a single stuffed bear. Travis needs some time to find himself. My mother dictated the moment I shut my car door. "You have a spare bedroom. You will take the boys." She did not ask. She issued a mandate. I stood on my own walkway, the heat radiating through the soles of my shoes. "Mom." "I work 12-hour shifts," I said, keeping my voice level. "I cannot just take 2 children with 0 notice." My mother narrowed her eyes, deploying a guilt trip she had practiced for decades. "You are a single woman with an empty house, Roz. You owe this family. Your brother is grieving. Do not be selfish." I looked at my brother. Travis was supposedly grieving a wife who passed away 3 years ago. Yet he stood on my porch smelling of high-end cologne, checking the notifications on his phone. He refused to meet the terrified gaze of his own sons. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and dropped it onto the wooden porch rail. "Get them some pizza or something," Travis muttered. He turned, walked down the steps, and climbed into his new truck, a custom trim model that cost more than my annual nursing salary. The engine roared, kicking up gravel as he backed out and sped down the street, leaving his children standing in the humid dusk. Brenda gave me a firm nod, satisfied that the transaction was complete, and walked to her own sedan without another word. I stepped onto the porch. Toby shivered despite the summer heat. I looked down at his feet. His sneakers were 2 sizes too small, the right toe held together by a strip of silver duct tape. I looked at the $20 bill resting on the rail. This was not a temporary favor for a struggling brother. I had been ambushed. I was the designated dumping ground for a burden my golden child brother refused to carry. I brought the boys inside and locked the door against the thick Arkansas heat. The spare bedroom sat at the end of the hall, a quiet space I used for reading and storing winter coats. I pointed them toward the twin bed. Leo and Toby walked with stiff, uncertain steps. They set their plastic trash bags on the floor. "Let us see what we have to work with," I said, keeping my tone light. I untied the red plastic string of the first bag. A sour smell drifted up into the room. Mildew, stale cigarette smoke, and unwashed cotton. I pulled out 3 oversized t-shirts, a pair of jeans with a broken zipper, and a single pair of socks. There were no pajamas. There were no toothbrushes. There was no underwear. Toby sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled off his duct-taped sneakers. His bare feet were red and blistered at the heels. The shoes were rigid and unforgiving, offering no support for a growing boy. Leo stood in front of his brother like a shield, his small shoulders tense. He watched my hands tracking every movement. I went to the bathroom, grabbed 2 clean towels, and ran a warm bath. I found some of my own oversized t-shirts for them to sleep in. That night they huddled together in the center of the twin bed. They did not ask for a bedtime story. They did not ask where their father went. They just stared at the ceiling in silence. The next morning, the reality of my brother's choices settled over my kitchen like a heavy frost. I stood at the stove scrambling eggs. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the space. I reached up and shut a cabinet door. The wood clicked against the frame. At the small kitchen table, Toby recoiled with such force his chair scraped loud against the linoleum. He dropped his fork. His hands went up to cover his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for an impact that was not coming. "Hey," I said soft and steady. "It is just the cabinet, Toby. You are safe here." He lowered his hands slowly, his chest heaving. Leo reached over and pulled Toby's plate closer to the center of the table. Leo looked at me with a guarded expression. "Are we allowed to eat the crusts?" he asked. My chest tightened. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "You can eat as much as you want, Leo. The whole piece." After breakfast, I gathered the few clothes they brought to run a load of laundry. I checked the pockets of Leo's denim jacket. My fingers brushed against something stiff. I pulled it out. It was a piece of stale toast wrapped tight in a paper napkin. He had hidden it during breakfast. He was hoarding food, terrified his next meal might never materialize. I stood in the laundry room holding that piece of dry bread. My nursing instincts collided with a deep, sickening anger. I deal with neglect at the clinic. I document it on patient charts. Seeing it in my own nephews shifted the ground beneath my feet. The $20 bill Travis left on the porch sat on the kitchen counter. It felt like an insult. The boys needed socks, underwear, proper shoes, and decent coats for the upcoming fall chill. My nursing salary covered my mortgage and basic bills. I lived a quiet, careful life. I did not have a slush fund for a sudden family expansion. I picked up my phone and dialed my father. Gary Pruitt owned 3 commercial real estate properties in Fort Smith. He drove a pristine luxury sedan and wore tailored suits to Sunday service. He was a pillar of the community, a man who shook hands with local politicians and commanded respect. He answered on the 4th ring. In the background, I could hear the muffled commentary of a televised golf tournament. "Dad." "I need some help," I said. "Travis dropped the boys off last night with nothing. They need shoes, underwear, and groceries. I need you to wire me some money to cover the basics." A heavy sigh crackled through the receiver, the sound of a man inconvenienced by reality. "Roz, your brother is going through a hard time." "A hard time," I repeated. He drove up in a brand-new truck smelling like designer cologne. "His kids do not have intact shoes, Dad." "Do not exaggerate." Gary snapped his tone, shifting from patronizing to sharp. "Travis just needs a minute to breathe. He has a lot on his plate right now. Stop making this about money and be a team player for once in your life." The hypocrisy burned the back of my throat. Just last month, my mother boasted at a church picnic that Gary had written a 5-figure check to cover Travis's initiation fee at the Hardscrabble Country Club. My father was willing to fund a luxury golf membership to maintain the image of his successful son, but he refused to buy his own grandsons a gallon of milk. "Dad, I am telling you, these boys are traumatized. They are hoarding food." Gary cut me off. "You are being dramatic. You always do this, Roz. You look for problems where there are none. Just watch them for a few days and keep your mouth shut. I have to go." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. The sting of favoritism was a familiar ache, an old injury that never quite healed. I grew up in the shadow of my brother. When I put myself through nursing school working night shifts at a diner, my parents called it a practical choice for a plain girl. When Travis graduated high school with a C average, Gary bought him a sports car to celebrate his potential. Travis was the golden boy who could do no wrong. I was the reliable workhorse expected to quietly sweep up the wreckage he left behind. I grabbed my purse and drove the boys to a discount store on Midland Boulevard. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I walked down the aisles calculating prices in my head: a pack of generic underwear, 5 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of off-brand sneakers that would not pinch their heels, winter coats from the clearance rack, bread, peanut butter, apples, and milk. At the checkout register, I watched the total climb. I swiped my debit card, feeling a knot form in my stomach as my meager savings took a direct hit. I smiled at the boys, while the cashier bagged our items, hiding the financial panic tightening my chest. When we returned home, I tried to call my mother. The call went straight to voicemail. I texted Travis. No reply. The silence from my family was deafening. They had successfully offloaded their problem and shut off their phones. Sunday afternoon became a logistical nightmare. I sat at the kitchen table with my work schedule spread out in front of me. I worked 12-hour shifts at the family practice clinic. I could not leave 2 young children alone all day. I called my nursing supervisor, begging for a shift swap, promising to take on undesirable weekend hours in exchange for a few days of morning flexibility. I scrambled to map out a childcare plan, using neighbors and clinic favors, burning through my professional goodwill in a single afternoon. As evening fell, I walked down the hall to check on the boys. The door was cracked open. Leo and Toby were asleep, tangled in the spare blankets. They looked so small against the mattress. I stood in the doorway, the exhaustion of the weekend pressing down on my shoulders. My family had left me entirely isolated. I was performing the grueling unpaid labor required to clean up the messes of a brother who had never faced a single consequence in his pampered, protected life. I thought this was a weekend inconvenience. I thought Travis would sober up, face his responsibilities, and come back for his sons. I assumed my parents were just enabling his bad behavior for a few days. I did not know that while I was buying discount shoes and begging for shift swaps, a state file with my forged signature was already sitting on a desk downtown. I turned off the hallway light and went to prepare my uniform for Monday morning. I assumed the worst was over. I had no idea the real betrayal had not even begun. Monday morning in the clinic began with the familiar steady rhythm of chaos. I moved between exam rooms, taking blood pressures, checking temperatures, and updating charts. The smell of rubbing alcohol and the hum of the air conditioner provided a small clinical comfort. For a few hours I could focus on charting symptoms instead of the heavy silence of my own house. I had dropped Leo and Toby off with a trusted neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Higgins, promising to pick them up right after my shift. My mind kept drifting back to the tight, anxious grip Leo had on his brother's hand when I left them at her door. At 10:15, I was at the nurse's station organizing a stack of lab requisitions. The phone on the wall beside me buzzed. I checked the caller ID. It displayed an unfamiliar 501 area code. State government lines often looked like that. I picked it up expecting a prior authorization department or a Medicaid billing representative. "This is Rosalind Pruitt," I answered, uncapping my pen. "Ms. Pruitt, this is Sarah Jenkins with the Arkansas Division of Children and Family Services. Do you have a minute to speak privately?" The pen hovered above the notepad. A cold prickle traced its way down my spine. The State Child Welfare Agency did not call family practice clinics for casual check-ins. In a town like Fort Smith, a call from DCFS carried weight. I stepped away from the busy station, pushing through the heavy wooden door into a quiet supply closet. I leaned against shelves stacked with sterile gauze and saline boxes. "Yes, I am here. Is something wrong?" Sarah's voice was crisp, professional, moving through a routine checklist. "I am calling to finalize the file on the permanent kinship placement your family executed last Thursday. We just need to verify a few details regarding your home inspection requirements and confirm the address for the state records." I stared at the white linoleum floor. The words did not connect in my brain. Permanent kinship placement. Executed. Last Thursday, I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to process the information. "Ma'am, there must be a mistake," I said. My voice sounded thin, tight in the small room. "My brother just dropped his sons off at my house on Friday night. He said he needed a weekend to clear his head. I did not sign up for any permanent placement. I only agreed to babysit." The line went dead quiet. In my line of work, I know the sound of a professional realizing they have walked into a disaster. I could hear the faint click of a keyboard on her end. Ms. Pruitt Sarah said, her professional brevity shifting into a cautious, sharp concern. "I have a notarized affidavit sitting on my desk right now. It was filed in person at the county clerk's office on Thursday afternoon. It designates you as the permanent physical guardian of Leo and Toby Pruitt. It bears the signatures of Gary Pruitt, Brenda Pruitt, Travis Pruitt, and your signature." My lungs seized. The air in the supply closet felt instantly too thin to breathe. I pressed my palm flat against the metal shelving rack to steady my balance. I did not sign any affidavit. I did not even know this document existed until this second. Sarah exhaled a sharp breath. Forgery is a serious matter, Ms. Pruitt. If you are telling me your signature was falsified on a state custody document that changes the entire nature of this case. My mind raced back to Friday night on the porch, Brenda standing with her arms crossed issuing a mandate, Travis avoiding his children's eyes, dropping a $20 bill on the rail. They had already filed the paperwork. They knew exactly what they were doing before they even pulled into my driveway. They had ambushed me not with a weekend favor, but with a permanent legal bind. My parents had taken my name, a name I had worked hard to build a quiet, respectable life around, and signed it to a legal document without a shred of hesitation. "Why would they do that?" I whispered into the phone, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Why go through the trouble of forging state documents just to make me babysit? There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that precedes bad news. I heard the rustle of paper being turned. "Ms. Pruitt," Sarah said slowly, "I am looking at the financial disclosures attached to the broader family court file. The boy's mother passed away 3 years ago in an auto accident, correct?" "Yes," I answered, confused. "Travis received a settlement, but he always said it was barely enough to cover the hospital bills. He said the lawyers took most of it." Sarah's voice dropped into a somber, grim register. "That is not what the court record says. The wrongful death settlement paid out $400,000. It was placed into a structured trust intended for the long-term care and education of Leo and Toby. Additionally, the state issues a monthly survivor benefit check of $1,500 for their direct physical maintenance." I gripped the phone tight enough that my knuckles ached. $400,000. A monthly check. The numbers rang in my ears like a siren. I thought of Toby's duct-taped shoes. I thought of Leo hoarding stale toast. Gary and Travis Pruitt are listed as the joint financial trustees of those funds. Sarah continued laying out the facts with clinical precision. They retain full control over the disbursement of the settlement and the monthly state checks. However, to satisfy the state that the boys are in a stable environment and to prevent mandatory welfare audits, they submitted this kinship affidavit claiming you eagerly volunteered to take on the physical housing, feeding, and medical care of the children. The pieces snapped together with a sickening, violent clarity. My family did not just abandon Leo and Toby on my porch. They monetized them. Gary and Travis set up a legal barrier, positioning themselves to drain the massive settlement and cash the monthly survivor checks to fund their luxury lifestyles. Travis drove a $70,000 custom truck. Gary paid country club dues. They were living like kings on money meant to protect 2 grieving children. But raising traumatized children requires work. It requires patience money, early mornings, and doctor visits. Travis did not want the work. Gary did not want the inconvenience. So they forged my name on a state document, shifting 100% of the physical labor and financial burden onto my shoulders. They intended for me to drain my modest nursing salary to feed and clothe the boys, while they siphoned the trust fund in the background. Worse yet, by naming me the physical guardian on paper, they had built a perfect scapegoat. If Leo's teachers noticed his malnutrition, or if Toby's doctor reported his rotting teeth, the state would not investigate Travis or Gary. The state would come knocking on my door. I would take the legal fall for their criminal neglect. I leaned my head back against the wall of the supply closet. The betrayal was so immense, so perfectly calculated, it made my vision blur. This was not a brother stumbling through grief. This was not a father being protective. This was a coordinated financial predation executed by my own blood. "Ms. Pruitt." Sarah's voice pulled me back from the edge of panic. "Are you still there? I am here." "If this signature is forged," Sarah said, her tone neighborly but firm, "this moves from a family court matter to a criminal fraud investigation. I need to flag this file, but you need to understand that if I do that, the state will open a full inquiry into Gary and Travis Pruitt." I closed my eyes. For 46 years, I had played the role my family assigned me. I was the quiet one, the plain one. The one who did not make waves, who swallowed insults at Sunday dinners, who swept up the messes the golden child left behind. My parents relied on my silence. They bet their stolen fortune on the certainty that I would be too scared, too loyal, and too weak to challenge them. They bet wrong. I opened my eyes. The sterile shelves of the supply closet snapped back into sharp focus. "Flag the file, Sarah," I said. My voice did not shake. It sounded calm, cold, and entirely unfamiliar. "I want a copy of that affidavit sent to my email immediately, and I want the contact information for the state fraud investigator." I hung up the phone. The clinic hallway outside the door was still buzzing with activity. Life was moving forward ordinary and oblivious. But inside that closet, a fundamental tether to my past snapped clean in half. I smoothed my scrubs, took a deep breath of the sterile air, and walked back out to the nurse's station. I had 2 boys waiting for me at the end of my shift, and I had a family to dismantle. I clocked out of the clinic a few minutes past 3 in the afternoon. The heavy Arkansas heat hit me the moment the automatic glass doors slid open, thick and stagnant, pressing down on my shoulders like a wet wool blanket. The sky was a pale, hazy blue, offering no relief from the sweltering humidity. I walked to my 10-year-old sedan, the asphalt radiating heat through the thin soles of my nursing shoes. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles pale. The conversation with Sarah from the state office played on a relentless loop in my head. Before picking up Leo and Toby from Mrs. Higgins, I needed to run a quick errand downtown. The boys had arrived with nothing, and I needed to buy them basic hygiene items. I drove toward Garrison Avenue, the historic heart of Fort Smith, where old brick facades housed a mix of local pharmacies, antique shops, and high-end dining. I parked along the curb and pushed through the doors of a corner pharmacy. The harsh, cool air conditioning was a stark contrast to the muggy street. I walked down the narrow aisles, my eyes scanning the shelves for children's dental care. I picked up 2 soft, bristled toothbrushes and a tube of mild, unflavored toothpaste. I avoided the brand-name items, calculating the few remaining dollars in my checking account. As I stood in the checkout line holding the crinkling plastic bag, a hollow ache settled in my chest. I thought back to the early hours of that morning, long before the phone call that shattered my reality. I had stood in my small kitchen, toasting 2 slices of cheap white bread for the boys. Toby sat at the table, his legs swinging too short to reach the linoleum floor. I had spread a thin layer of butter on the toast and set a plate in front of him. He picked it up eagerly. But the moment he took a small bite, he let out a sharp, breathless whimper. The piece of toast dropped from his fingers, clattering against the ceramic plate. Toby slapped both hands over his mouth, his eyes welling with sudden sharp tears. He shrank back into his chair, bracing himself as if he expected to be punished for making a noise. Leo was at his side in an instant, his small hands hovering over his brother's shoulders, a protective shield born of necessity. I knelt beside Toby's chair, keeping my voice a low, steady murmur. "Let me see, sweetheart," I whispered. "You are not in trouble. Just let Aunt Roz look." It took a few minutes of gentle coaxing before he slowly lowered his hands. When he opened his mouth, the sight made my stomach turn. Dark decay hugged his gum line. The enamel on his back molars was worn away, exposing raw, sensitive nerves. His gums were inflamed and swollen. It was a textbook case of prolonged severe dental neglect, a condition that takes years of skipped checkups and poor diet to develop. I had soaked his toast in a cup of warm milk just so he could swallow a few bites without crying. The memory of his small, pained face burned in my mind as I paid the cashier for the generic toothbrushes. I stepped back out into the punishing afternoon heat, the pharmacy door swinging shut behind me. I began the short walk back to my parked car, keeping my head down, lost in the grim mathematics of survival. $400,000 in a structured trust, $1,500 a month in state survivor benefits. The numbers felt abstract on the phone, a distant bureaucratic reality. Then I heard the laugh. It was a loud, booming sound, rich with unearned confidence. A laugh I had heard at countless Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. A laugh that meant my father had just handed over a blank check, or my mother had just smoothed over another one of his reckless mistakes. I stopped walking. Just a few yards away stood the outdoor patio of Fort Smith's most exclusive steakhouse. Wrought iron fencing enclosed a shaded seating area. Industrial misting fans sprayed a fine, cooling fog over the patrons. The scent of seared ribeye, expensive bourbon, and melted butter drifted onto the sidewalk. There, sitting at a prime corner table surrounded by 3 other local men, was my brother. Travis was leaning back in a plush wrought iron chair, looking relaxed and radiant. He wore a crisp, tailored linen shirt that hung perfectly across his shoulders. His hair was freshly cut. On his left wrist, catching the afternoon sunlight, gleamed a heavy designer steel watch, a piece of jewelry that cost more than my car. He was holding his smartphone out, swiping through photos for the men at his table. She has twin outboard motors. Travis boasted, his voice carrying easily over the low hum of the patio conversation. Leather upholstery, custom sound system. The dealer tried to waitlist me, but I threw down a cash deposit yesterday morning. Bypassed the whole line. We are taking her out on Lake Hamilton this weekend. The men around the table whistled in appreciation, clinking their sweating pint glasses together. I stood frozen on the hot concrete sidewalk, clutching a plastic bag containing $5 worth of dental supplies. The abstract numbers from the state caseworker suddenly materialized into visceral, undeniable reality. The financial theft was not just numbers on a ledger. The theft was the gleaming steel watch on my brother's wrist. The theft was the custom speedboat waiting for him on the water. The theft was the seared steak on his plate. Every luxury Travis flaunted had been bought and paid for with his children's suffering. The money meant to fix Toby's rotting teeth had paid for the down payment on that boat. The monthly checks meant to put a proper winter coat on Leo's back and safe shoes on his feet were funding rounds of expensive craft beer on a Tuesday afternoon. My brother had legally positioned himself as a grieving widower, doing his best hoarding the wealth meant to heal his motherless children. He had then dumped those same children on my doorstep, forging my signature on state documents to ensure I bore the crushing weight of his responsibilities. He was trading their literal health and safety for status symbols. I felt a physical reaction ripple through my body. My chest tightened, the air suddenly catching in my throat. My hands trembled, the thin plastic handles of the shopping bag digging into my palms. For 46 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the reliable, invisible daughter. When Travis wrecked Gary's car in high school, my parents grounded me for not keeping a closer eye on him. When Travis failed his college courses, Gary blamed the professors while I worked night shifts at a diner to pay for my own nursing certification. I was conditioned to accept the unfairness taught that keeping the peace meant swallowing my own dignity. I looked at the men on the patio, laughing at a joke Travis just told. Then Travis turned his head. Through the sheer curtain of the misting fans, his eyes met mine. He stopped laughing. The other men continued their conversation, oblivious to the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Travis did not look surprised to see me. He did not look ashamed. He did not shrink away, fearful that his sister had caught him living a life of luxury while his children wore duct-taped shoes. Instead, the jovial smile on his face morphed into something else. It flattened into a condescending, untouchable smirk. He looked at my faded nursing scrubs. He looked at the cheap plastic bag in my hand. He looked at my tired, practical shoes. His eyes communicated a lifetime of arrogant superiority. He knew exactly what he had done to me with that forged affidavit. He knew he had trapped me, forcing me to drain my bank account while he drained the trust fund. And he believed he was entirely invincible. He believed I was too weak, too quiet, and too deeply conditioned by decades of forced family loyalty to ever raise my voice. He assumed I would dutifully take the boys, absorb the financial ruin, and keep the secret to protect the family name, just as I had always done. Without breaking eye contact, Travis slowly reached out and picked up his sweating glass of craft beer. He raised it a few inches off the table, tilting the rim toward me in a silent, mocking toast. He took a slow sip, set the glass down, and turned his attention back to the photos of his new boat. The heat of the Arkansas sun faded into the background. The street noise muted into a low, distant hum. In that profound, heavy silence, the final thread of my lifelong subservience snapped. The fear of my father's wrath, the dread of my mother's guilt, trips the constant, exhausting desire to earn a place in a family that viewed me as disposable. It all evaporated. In its place, a cold, unbreakable resolve took root in the center of my chest. Travis had handed me his children because he thought I was a pushover. He thought he was assigning me a burden. He did not realize that by forcing those boys into my home, he had handed me the very evidence I needed to dismantle his entire life. I turned away from the wrought iron fence, my spine straight, and walked back to my car. I did not need to confront him on a restaurant patio. I did not need to scream or cause a public scene. I was a nurse. I knew how to document a chart. I knew how to build a case. My brother wanted me to play the silent, obedient caretaker. I would play the role perfectly right up until the moment I burned his unearned empire to the ground. The morning after I watched my brother toast his new speedboat, I walked through the sliding glass doors of the family practice clinic. I did not clock in for my nursing shift. I entered as a patient guardian holding Leo by the right hand and Toby by the left. The waiting room hummed with the quiet, orderly routine of daytime medicine. The scent of sterile wipes and worn magazine pages hung in the cool air. I guided the boys to a row of vinyl chairs in the corner. Toby sat close to my side, his small fingers twisting the hem of the oversized t-shirt I had given him. Leo watched the reception desk with guarded, vigilant eyes, scanning the room for threats that only he could see. I had specifically requested an appointment with Dr. Arthur Evans. Dr. Evans was not just the senior physician at the clinic. He was a fixture in the Fort Smith community. With his silver hair and steady, reassuring demeanor, he commanded deep respect across the county. He sat on the hospital board. He attended the same country club galas and Sunday church services as my parents. Dr. Evans knew Gary Pruitt. He knew the polished, wealthy veneer my father projected to the world. He knew the narrative of the flawless, prosperous Pruitt family. I needed a man like Dr. Evans to look past the veneer and document the reality. When the nurse called our names, we walked down the tiled hallway into exam room 3. I helped the boys change into paper gowns. The crinkling sound made Toby flinch, his shoulders drawing up toward his ears. I knelt in front of him, keeping my voice low and steady, promising him that no one here would hurt him. Dr. Evans knocked twice before opening the door. He walked in carrying a digital tablet, offering a warm, practiced smile that faltered the moment he took a closer look at the 2 boys sitting on the exam table. Roz. Dr. Evans said, his brow furrowing. "These are Travis's boys, correct? Gary showed me a photo of them at the Rotary breakfast a few months ago. He said they were doing wonderful. They are not doing wonderful, Arthur," I said. My voice held a clinical detachment, a shield I wore to keep my hands from shaking. "I need you to give them a comprehensive physical evaluation. Document everything." Dr. Evans caught the gravity in my tone. He set his tablet on the counter and reached for his stethoscope. The ensuing 40 minutes were the longest of my life. I stood by the sink, forcing myself to watch as the undeniable evidence of my brother's greed was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the exam room. When Leo removed his shirt, the sharp outlines of his ribs pressed against his pale skin. He was drastically underweight for an 8-year-old. Dr. Evans charted his height and weight, the percentile falling into a dangerous, severe deficit. When he placed the stethoscope against Leo's narrow chest, a distinct rattling wheeze echoed in the quiet room. "Leo has untreated asthma," Dr. Evans murmured, his jaw tightening. "His lungs are struggling. Has he been prescribed an inhaler?" "He brought nothing with him," I replied. Dr. Evans moved on to Toby. He asked the 6-year-old to open his mouth. Toby whimpered, shrinking back against the crinkling paper on the exam table. I stepped forward, holding Toby's hand, whispering that it would be over soon. When he finally parted his lips, Dr. Evans let out a slow, heavy breath. The dental decay was profound. The gums were swollen, bleeding at the edges. Several primary molars were black and eroded down to the nerve. It was a staggering visual of prolonged systemic neglect. This level of rot causes constant daily pain. Dr. Evans said, his professional demeanor slipping into deep paternal distress. He cannot eat solid food without agonizing discomfort. "This does not happen overnight, Roz. This is years of skipped appointments and poor nutrition. I need to refer him to a pediatric oral surgeon today. Let me get their insurance information on file." I reached into my purse and pulled out the crumpled insurance card I had found stuffed in the bottom of Travis's trash bags. I handed it to Dr. Evans. He swiped his badge at the computer terminal in the corner of the room and typed the identification number into the state health registry network. The screen blinked. Dr. Evans frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. He retyped the numbers. "Roz, this policy is inactive," he said, turning to face me. "The coverage was terminated 6 months ago for non-payment. The clinical shield I had been holding on to cracked. My brother drove a brand new $70,000 truck. My father wrote 5-figure checks for golf memberships. Travis received $1,500 a month from the state specifically earmarked for the care and maintenance of his children. Travis had canceled his children's health insurance. He stopped paying the premiums so he could pocket a few extra $100 a month. He let his 6-year-old son suffer with rotting teeth, and his 8-year-old son struggle to breathe, all to fund his steakhouse dinners and custom boat accessories. The sheer gravity of the betrayal pressed down on my chest. For decades, my parents gaslit me into believing I was dramatic, overly sensitive, and ungrateful. They demanded I sweep up the wreckage of my brother's life and smile while I did it. They convinced the entire town of Fort Smith that the Pruitt family was a pillar of morality and grace. I looked at Toby holding a cold compress to his swollen jaw. I looked at Leo, his frail shoulders hunched forward. My stoicism broke. Tears hot and heavy with years of suppressed rage spilled over my eyelashes. "Arthur," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Travis dropped them on my porch Friday night. He told me he just needed a weekend. But on Monday, a caseworker from the state called me. My father, my mother, and Travis forged my signature on a notarized state affidavit. They legally transferred permanent physical custody to me without my knowledge." Dr. Evans stared at me, the blood draining from his face. "Forged your signature. They did it to hide a $400,000 wrongful death settlement." I continued the truth pouring out of me in a ragged, desperate flood. "Travis and my dad set themselves up as the financial trustees. They are draining the trust to fund Travis's lifestyle. They dumped the boys on me and falsified the paperwork so that if the state ever investigated this neglect, I would be the one holding the bag. I would be the one going to jail." The silence in the exam room was heavy and suffocating. Dr. Evans looked from me to the emaciated boys on the table and back to the computer screen showing the canceled insurance policy. In that quiet space, the pristine, untouchable image of Gary Pruitt shattered. Dr. Evans was a man who played golf with my father. He sat across from him at charity banquets. Now he was looking at the undeniable human cost of my family's hidden rot. Dr. Evans closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, the warm, jovial physician the town knew had been replaced by a fierce, protective ally. He walked across the room and placed a steady, comforting hand on my shoulder. "You are not alone in this, Roz," he said, his voice carrying the quiet strength of a man who held power and knew how to use it. "I have known you for 10 years. I see how you care for the patients in this clinic. I see how you are fighting for these boys right now. Your family thinks they can hide behind their money and their name. They cannot hide from medical evidence." Dr. Evans turned back to the computer. "I am overriding the billing system," he stated, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I am putting this visit, the asthma treatments, and the pediatric dental referral under an emergency clinic grant. Travis Pruitt will not see a dime of this." He printed out the detailed medical charts. Page after page of documented neglect, severe malnutrition, untreated respiratory issues, and advanced dental decay. At the bottom of each page, Dr. Evans signed his name in bold black ink. He stamped them with the official seal of the medical practice. He gathered the stack of papers, placed them into a thick manila folder, and handed it to me. "Keep this safe," he instructed, his eyes locking onto mine. "This is your proof. If your father or your brother tries to threaten you, or if the state comes asking questions, you show them my signature. I will stand up in any courtroom in Arkansas and testify to what I saw in this room today." I took the folder. It felt heavy in my hands, a profound weight that anchored me to reality. For my entire life, my family dictated the narrative. They controlled what was true and what was false. But looking down at the official medical charts, feeling the fierce, unwavering support of a respected community leader, I realized the power dynamic was shifting. My family's secrets were bleeding out into the light. I was no longer the isolated, helpless scapegoat cowering in the shadow of my wealthy parents. I had physical proof. I had a witness. I wiped my face, tucked the folder under my arm, and helped the boys down from the exam table. The fear that had ruled my life was gone, replaced by a deep, enduring duty to protect the 2 children my brother threw away. The town of Fort Smith was about to learn who the Pruitt family truly was, and I was holding the match. I drove Leo and Toby back to my house in a heavy, contemplative silence. The thick manila folder resting on the passenger seat felt like a loaded weapon. I carried it inside and placed it flat on my kitchen table. I needed to feed the boys before I made my next move. I opened a jar of unsweetened applesauce and warmed it in the microwave, testing the temperature on my wrist to ensure it would not agitate Toby's exposed nerves. The 6-year-old sat at the table and took a slow, tentative bite. He paused, waiting for the sharp pain to strike. When the soft food slid over his teeth without a sting, his shoulders dropped. He let out a quiet sigh of relief and continued eating. Leo sat beside him, watching his younger brother with a protective intensity that broke my heart. 8-year-old children should not have to guard each other from the world. I left them in the kitchen with strict instructions to watch their favorite cartoon on the living room television. I walked into my bedroom and closed the door. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, dusty shadows across my quilt. I sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled my laptop from its case. I opened a basic audio recording application and tested the microphone. The green bar bounced as I spoke a test phrase. I picked up my cell phone, dialed my father's number, and placed the device on speakerphone directly next to the computer. I clicked the red record button. The screen displayed a running timer. Gary Pruitt answered on the 3rd ring. The background noise was unmistakable. The clinking of fine crystal, the low murmur of polite conversation, the soft classical music playing overhead. He was at a business lunch, likely at the country club dining room. "What is it, Roz?" my father asked. His tone was clipped and irritated, the voice of a very important man interrupted by a nuisance. "I am in the middle of a meeting with the zoning board. Dad, I need to talk to you about the boys," I said, keeping my voice steady and casual. I was playing a part. I needed him to believe I was still the confused, overwhelmed daughter seeking his guidance. My father let out a long, put-upon sigh. "I told you on Saturday Travis just needs a few days to get his head straight. Quit pestering me." "This is not about babysitting," I replied. Toby was in agonizing pain this morning. I had to take both of them to the clinic to see Dr. Evans. Toby needs a pediatric oral surgeon. His teeth are rotting down to the nerve. When I tried to use the insurance card Travis packed, the system flagged it. The policy was canceled 6 months ago for non-payment. The clinking of silverware on the other end of the line stopped. "I need to know how we are paying for this surgery, Dad. I cannot put this on my credit card." The silence stretched for 3 seconds. When my father spoke again, his voice had dropped an octave, adopting the smooth, practiced tone he used to close real estate deals. "Roz, you are overreacting," he said smoothly. "Dr. Evans is an alarmist. Kids get cavities. It is part of growing up. Travis did not cancel anything. You probably read the policy number wrong at the front desk. And even if there is a gap in coverage, you can cover a simple dentist trip. You have no dependents. Stop being a penny pincher and help your family." I stared at the green recording bar bouncing on my laptop screen. He was doubling down. He was denying the undeniable and shifting the financial burden onto me. "It is not a simple cavity, Dad," I pushed back, letting a note of firm authority slip into my voice. "Dr. Evans charted severe long-term neglect, and I know I do not have to pay for it out of pocket. I spoke to a state caseworker this morning. I know about the wrongful death settlement. I know there is $400,000 meant for these boys." The background noise on the phone shifted abruptly. I heard a chair scrape against a hardwood floor. "Excuse me for a moment, gentlemen," my father muttered to his lunch companions. I heard the rustle of clothing, the heavy thud of a door closing, and then the muffled quiet of a private hallway. When he returned to the phone, the polite businessman was gone. "Listen to me very carefully," Gary hissed. "You have no idea how finance works. You are a nurse. You change bedpans. That settlement money is tied up in complex investments to secure the boys' future college tuition. It is not a slush fund for you to tap into just because you want a payday. You see a dollar sign, and suddenly you want to milk your grieving brother. You are a greedy opportunist, Roz. The projection was breathtaking. He and Travis were stealing from orphans to buy luxury boats and pay golf dues, yet he painted me as the greedy spinster trying to profit from a tragedy. For 46 years, this gaslighting had worked. He would twist reality until I doubted my own memories and retreated into silence. But I had the medical file sitting on my kitchen table. I had the caseworker's confirmation. The gaslighting had lost its power. I do not want a single dime of that money, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, flat register. I want the boys to have the medical care they are legally entitled to, and I know why you are hiding the funds. I know about the permanent placement affidavit, Dad. You and Travis forged my signature on a state custody document. The line went dead silent. The truth hung in the air between us, a heavy, undeniable accusation. The power dynamic shifted in that single heartbeat. He realized I had breached the vault. I was no longer the obedient scapegoat. I was a direct threat to his freedom, his reputation, and his wealth. My father did not deny the forgery. He did not apologize. Instead, he dropped the benevolent patriarch mask entirely. The true face of Gary Pruitt emerged from the shadows. "You are walking on thin ice, little girl." He sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can play detective? You think anyone in this town is going to take the word of a bitter, childless woman over mine? I have played golf with the local judges for 20 years. I fund the Police Benevolent Association in Hot Springs. I know everyone who matters." I held my breath, letting him dig his own grave on the recording. "If you make a fuss about this paperwork," Gary continued, his tone escalating into a terrifying, measured threat, "if you call that caseworker back, or if you cause any trouble for Travis, I will ruin you. I will have my lawyers draft a petition claiming you are mentally unstable. I will tell the court you are a hysterical woman making up lies because you are obsessed with my grandsons." The sheer malice in his words chilled me to the bone. He was outlining a plot to destroy my professional nursing license and my sanity simply to protect a stolen inheritance. And then he delivered the ultimate betrayal. "If you push me, Roz, I will have those boys thrown into the state foster system by the end of the week," Gary snarled. "They will be separated. They will end up in group homes, and you will never see them again. Keep your mouth shut and do what women in this family do. Clean up the mess and smile." The line clicked and went dead. I sat on the edge of my bed. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the room. The green bar on the laptop screen rested at 0. I reached forward and clicked the save button. I titled the audio file with the date and my father's name. I exported the file to my secure email server, making 3 separate digital backups. The betrayal settled deep into my bones, a cold, dark anchor. My own father was perfectly willing to destroy his own flesh and blood. He was willing to throw traumatized children into the foster care system and ruin his daughter's life, all to protect his golden son's luxury spending and his own arrogant pride. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he won the argument by terrifying me. He believed his brutal threats would silence me forever, just as they always had. He did not know I had recorded every single word. I stood up from the bed. I was no longer fighting a difficult father. I was fighting a predator, and I was going to tear his pristine, untouchable reputation to shreds. By Wednesday morning, the backlash arrived like a sudden, violent summer storm sweeping across the Ozarks. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring Leo a bowl of generic cereal, when my phone vibrated against the laminate countertop. Then it vibrated again, and again. The notifications stacked up on the lock screen in rapid succession, a relentless drumbeat of hostility. Gary had recognized that my silence on the phone the previous day was not submission. It was a tactical retreat. Understanding that I now held undeniable leverage, the knowledge of the forged affidavit, and the medical charts my parents decided to strike first. They could not control the facts, so they decided to control the narrative. They initiated a preemptive smear campaign designed to destroy my credibility before I could ever utter a word of truth to the outside world. They unleashed their flying monkeys. In every toxic family hierarchy, the patriarch relies on an extended network of eager enablers. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who trade their moral compass for proximity to the patriarch's wealth and social status. Gary and Brenda activated this network with surgical precision, feeding them a fabricated story, painting me as an unhinged, greedy villain. I picked up the phone. The first text was from Aunt Diane, my father's younger sister who lived across town and frequently relied on Gary to fund her annual vacations to Branson. Roz, I cannot believe what your father just told me. Threatening to call the state on your own brother just to extort babysitting money from him. Travis is a grieving widower doing his absolute best. You are a disgrace to the Pruitt name. Return those boys to their father immediately. I stared at the glowing screen. Return the boys to their father. Travis had abandoned them on my porch, forged my signature to avoid raising them, and canceled their health insurance. Yet the family narrative had already twisted the reality, claiming I was holding the children hostage for ransom. Before I could process the sheer audacity of Diane's text, another message arrived. This one was from Cousin Paul, a man who worked as a junior associate at Gary's real estate firm. His career depended entirely on my father's goodwill. We all know you have always been jealous of Travis Roz, but trying to milk a tragedy for a payday is a new low. Drop the act. Dad said you are having a mental breakdown. Get help before you ruin this family. The gaslighting was coordinated and suffocating. My father had executed the exact threat he made on the phone. He was planting the seeds of my mental instability throughout the extended family, ensuring that if I tried to show anyone the forged affidavit, they would dismiss it as the paranoid delusion of a bitter, childless woman. A heavy, familiar weight settled over my chest. This was the exact dynamic that had ruled my childhood. Whenever Travis caused a disaster, my parents formed a protective wall around him, turning the family's collective judgment onto me for failing to prevent the mess. The isolation was absolute. It was a crushing, lonely darkness that made you doubt your own sanity. I stood alone against a wall of unified family delusion. The phone vibrated again this time with a notification from Facebook. I opened the application. My mother Brenda had just published a public post. She tagged 30 family members and her most influential church friends. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive martyrdom. There is no pain quite like the betrayal of your own flesh and blood, Brenda wrote, accompanied by a picture of a wilting rose. Travis has sacrificed everything to be a good father after his tragic loss. It breaks my heart to see his trust abused by someone who should be supporting him. Some women, especially those who have never experienced the selfless joy of raising children of their own, simply do not understand the meaning of family sacrifice. Praying for peace and healing for my sweet grandsons today. The post was a public execution. The comments poured in immediately from church elders, neighbors, and extended relatives offering prayers for Brenda and expressing subtle, disgusted judgment toward the unnamed, childless woman. The community gossip was beginning to swirl. Fort Smith is a town where reputations are currency. A post like that from a woman of Brenda's standing was enough to ruin a person. It was designed to threaten my peace of mind, to make me feel the burning gaze of judgment when I walked into the grocery store or attended Sunday service. For 46 years, my response to this tactic had been identical. I would panic. I would internalize the shame. I would pick up the phone, call my mother in tears, and beg for her forgiveness. I would apologize for causing a fuss, promise to fall back into line, and assume the burden of my brother's mistakes, just to make the crushing social pressure stop. I looked at the text box beneath Aunt Diane's vicious message. The cursor blinked, waiting for my defense. I typed out a reply. Travis dumped them here. He stole their money. I have proof. I stared at the words. Then I deleted them. Arguing with an enabler is like pouring water into a bottomless well. They do not want the truth. They want the performance of submission. If I sent the text, Aunt Diane would show it to Gary, proving his claim that I was hysterical and combative. If I replied to Brenda's Facebook post, I would be dragged into a public muddy fight where her polished reputation would always beat my desperate defense. The scapegoat's greatest weapon is not a louder voice. It is the sudden, terrifying withdrawal of participation. I closed the messaging app. I did not reply to Diane. I did not defend myself to Paul. I did not comment on my mother's post. Instead, I pressed the side buttons on my phone and took a screenshot. I took a screenshot of Diane's text, confirming that Gary was spreading false narratives about extortion. I captured Paul's text, documenting the coordinated effort to label me mentally unstable. I saved a high-resolution image of Brenda's Facebook post and all the associated comments. I opened the digital folder I had created the night before the same folder containing the audio recording of Gary's threats and the PDF of the forged state affidavit. I uploaded the screenshots. I was building a meticulous, undeniable timeline of abuse, witness tampering, and defamation. My total silence sent a shockwave back up the family hierarchy. Gary and Brenda had fired their heaviest social artillery, expecting immediate surrender. When the afternoon turned to evening and their phones remained dark, no tearful apologies, no panicked explanations, no frantic pleas for reconciliation. The silence became deafening. I set my phone on silent and turned my attention back to the boys. Toby was sitting on the living room rug, building a small tower out of plastic blocks I had picked up at a thrift store. Leo was sitting close by, handing him the pieces. The contrast between the vicious, greedy adults manipulating social media and the quiet resilience of these neglected children hardened my resolve into steel. That night, my phone screen lit up with 3 missed calls from Gary, followed by a direct text from Brenda. "Roz, answer your phone. We need to handle this privately." They were realizing their mistake. My refusal to play my assigned role, my refusal to beg or engage in their manufactured drama, signaled a terrifying shift in the power dynamic. They could not control a narrative if the primary target refused to participate in the script. They expected a crying, broken daughter. They did not realize they had forged the signature of an executioner. I let the phone ring. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving them alone in the dark with their escalating desperation. The stage was set, and I was holding all the cards. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp, bright humidity, the kind of Arkansas day that makes the stained glass windows of the First Baptist Church glow with a brilliant, imposing light. This church was the epicenter of my parents' social empire. It was the theater where they performed their piety, where Gary shook hands with local judges, and where Brenda orchestrated her charity drives. It was the exact place they expected me to avoid. My parents operated on the assumption that shame was a silencing agent. After the vicious barrage of text messages and the highly public Facebook execution, they were certain I would spend the morning cowering in my house, too humiliated to show my face in public. They believed the social pressure they had manufactured would crush my spirit. They were wrong. I refused to hide. I spent the early morning getting Leo and Toby ready. I had washed the new properly fitting clothes I bought them from the discount store. I combed their hair, smoothing down the stubborn cowlicks. I knelt in the hallway, looking them in the eye. "We are going to church this morning," I said, keeping my tone light and encouraging. "You hold your heads up high. You are safe, and you look handsome." Toby nodded, gripping my hand tight. Leo stood a little straighter, sensing the gravity of the morning, even if he did not fully understand it. When we pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the church sanctuary, the low murmur of pre-service conversation was a steady hum. I walked down the center aisle holding a boy in each hand. The social consequences of Brenda's smear campaign hit me immediately, a physical wave of cold, silent judgment. As we walked past the third row, Aunt Diane leaned over to whisper sharply into Cousin Paul's ear, both of them glaring at me with open, unrestrained disgust. A few older women family friends who had undoubtedly read Brenda's post about the childless woman lacking sacrifice averted their eyes, burying their faces behind their hymnals. The air felt thick with condemnation. The flying monkeys were standing guard, enforcing the family narrative. I kept my chin level. I did not look away, and I did not shrink. I guided the boys into an empty pew near the middle of the sanctuary and sat down, my spine perfectly straight. 3 rows ahead and across the aisle sat my parents. Gary was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, speaking in hushed, authoritative tones to a city councilman. Brenda was beside him, draped in a tasteful pastel dress, the picture of a grieved maternal grace. When she turned her head and spotted me sitting there with the boys, her smile faltered. A flicker of genuine shock crossed her face before she quickly masked it, turning back to the councilman. She had not expected me to call her bluff. The organist began to play the prelude, signaling the start of the service. I opened a hymnal for Leo, ignoring the heavy stares burning into the back of my neck. I knew I was walking into hostile territory, but I also knew I was not walking in unarmed. I had strategically chosen my seat. On Thursday, when I sat in exam room 3, Dr. Evans had promised to back me up completely. I knew that in a town like Fort Smith, medical records held legal weight, but social currency held the ultimate power. The Pruitt family's control over the narrative relied entirely on the assumption that no one of equal or greater status would challenge them. Just as the choir director stepped up to the podium, a distinct rustle of movement broke the settling quiet of the sanctuary. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the wife of Dr. Arthur Evans, was walking down the side aisle. Margaret Evans was not just a doctor's wife. She was a prominent, highly influential church elder. She sat on the hospital auxiliary board and commanded a fierce, unshakable respect within the congregation. Where Brenda Pruitt's influence was built on money and performance, Margaret Evans's influence was built on decades of genuine community service and quiet moral authority. Margaret did not take her usual seat in the front row. Instead, she walked deliberately across the center of the sanctuary. The soft click of her heels drew the attention of the surrounding pews. She stopped at the edge of my row, offered a warm, bright smile, and slid into the empty space directly next to me. The murmuring in the nearby pews died instantly. Aunt Diane, sitting 2 rows back, sat up so straight she nearly dropped her purse. Margaret leaned over, placing a gentle, reassuring hand over mine. She did not whisper. She spoke in a clear, carrying voice, ensuring that the sound traveled effortlessly to the ears of every gossiping relative and church member sitting within a 10-foot radius. "Roz, dear, it is so good to see you this morning," Margaret said warmly. "Arthur told me you brought these sweet boys into the clinic this week." I squeezed her hand, playing my part perfectly. "It has been a difficult transition, Margaret," I replied, my voice steady. "But we are managing." Margaret turned her attention to Leo and Toby. She offered them a kind maternal smile that immediately put Toby at ease. "Well, they are certainly looking better today," she declared, her voice rising just enough to cut through the quiet prelude music. "It breaks my heart to hear about what they have been through." Arthur was just devastated when he saw the condition of Toby's teeth. It is a tragedy when children suffer from such severe, prolonged neglect. But they are in a safe, loving home now, and the entire clinic is praying for their recovery. The impact of her words was akin to a bomb detonating in the center of the sanctuary. The community narrative fractured in real time. Margaret Evans had just publicly, vocally validated my reality. She had confirmed, citing the unimpeachable authority of the town's most respected physician, that the boys were victims of severe neglect, directly contradicting Brenda's Facebook narrative of Travis, the sacrificing, grieving father. She had labeled my home as the safe haven, dismantling the lie that I was an unstable, greedy opportunist. The whispers that had been directed at me a moment ago suddenly shifted direction. The women holding the hymnals lowered them, exchanging shocked, recalculating glances. The silence in the surrounding rows became electric buzzing with sudden explosive realization. If Dr. Evans saw severe neglect, then the story Brenda was peddling on social media was a lie. I glanced toward the front of the church. Brenda was sitting rigid, her knuckles white, as she gripped the wooden edge of the pew. She was staring straight ahead, but I could see the rigid tension in her jaw. Gary was no longer speaking to the councilman. The councilman had turned slightly away, his posture suddenly guarded and distant. The pristine reputation my parents relied upon for their social status was visibly threatened by the exact community they used to maintain it. The flying monkeys, realizing that associating with Gary and Brenda might now carry the taint of child neglect, began to subtly distance themselves. Aunt Diane stared at the back of my head no longer with disgust, but with an emerging, fearful suspicion. The power dynamic began to permanently shift. My parents had built their empire on secrets, hiding Travis's incompetence behind closed doors and punishing anyone who dared speak the truth. But secrets lose their power the moment they bleed into the light. The truth about the boy's condition was now circulating through the most influential ranks of the community, and Gary's money could not buy silence from the wife of the chief medical officer. The golden child's protective shield was cracking. As the congregation stood for the opening hymn, I looked down at Leo. He was holding the hymn book, attempting to follow along with the music. Toby stood close, holding on to the edge of my scrub jacket. They were safe. The fear that had choked me for 46 years was completely gone. I sang the hymn with a clear, steady voice. I had walked into my parents' stronghold, and I had watched their authority crumble with a few strategically placed words. I knew the war was far from over. Gary would not surrender his control or his stolen wealth without a vicious fight. But as I watched the congregation covertly studying the back of my father's head, I knew one undeniable truth. I was no longer the scapegoat, and they were no longer untouchable. The fallout from Sunday morning bled into the work week like a slow-moving stain on white fabric. The whispers Margaret Evans had seeded in the sanctuary took root, twisting the town's perception of the Pruitt family. By Tuesday afternoon, the shift in power was palpable even outside the church walls. I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing out Toby's favorite plastic cup, when the heavy, aggressive rumble of a diesel engine shattered the quiet of my neighborhood. I looked out the window over the sink. Travis's custom lifted Ford truck swerved sharply into my driveway, the oversized tires kicking up gravel before slamming to a halt just inches from my garage door. He did not turn off the engine. The truck idled loudly, a mechanical growl vibrating through the floorboards of my house. I set the cup down and wiped my hands on a dish towel. I had spent the weekend installing a small, inconspicuous security camera above my front door. A cheap motion-activated unit I ordered online, angled to capture the entire porch and driveway. I pulled out my phone, opened the camera application, and checked the live feed. The recording indicator was blinking red. Travis threw open his driver's side door. He was not wearing his tailored linen shirt or a relaxed country club smile. He looked disheveled. His face was flushed a tight, mottled red, and his movements were jerky and frantic. He slammed the truck door shut and stomped up my front walkway. I walked to the front door, checked the deadbolt, and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind me with a solid click. I stood on the top step, physically placing myself between my brother and the children inside my home. "Where are they?" Travis demanded, stopping at the bottom of the steps. His voice was loud, lacking his usual slick charm. He smelled faintly of stale beer and sharp metallic sweat. "Go get the boys. I need them right now." I crossed my arms. The humid evening air pressed against us. "You are not taking them anywhere, Travis. You dropped them off 5 days ago and vanished." "I do not have time for a lecture from you, Roz," he barked, jabbing a finger in my direction. He took a step up, his physical presence looming. "Go inside and get their coats. We are going to the country club for dinner. I need to get some pictures of us on the patio." The audacity of his demand was staggering. He did not ask how they were sleeping. He did not ask if Toby's teeth still hurt. He did not ask if Leo was eating. He needed a photo op. The social consequences of Sunday morning were closing in on him. The whispers Margaret Evans started had undoubtedly reached the country club dining room. The people who had laughed at his jokes and admired his new watch a few days ago were now looking at him through the lens of a father who starved his children to buy a boat. He was feeling the burn of community judgment, and his narcissistic defense mechanism kicked in. He needed to manufacture immediate visual proof of his devotion to post on social media to counter the spreading rumors. But it was more than just gossip driving his panic. "I am not waking them up so you can use them as props for your Facebook page," I said, keeping my tone deadly calm. "And a photo is not going to fix your problem, Travis. I know about the medical audit." Travis froze on the second step. The flush on his face deepened, the mottled red creeping down his neck. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice dropping into a dangerous, ragged register. When Dr. Evans flagged Toby's extensive dental decay and Leo's untreated asthma, he did more than write a chart note. He had utilized his position to trigger an automatic medical review through the state health registry. That quiet, bureaucratic move temporarily froze the disbursement of the monthly survivor benefits until the state could verify the children's physical safety. Travis's direct deposit had not cleared. "You heard me," I replied, standing firm. Dr. Evans reported the neglect. The state froze the funds. You cannot buy your way out of this with a picture on a golf course. You canceled their insurance. You stole their trust money. Travis lunged forward, closing the distance between us, until he was standing on the porch, towering over me. The smell of alcohol was stronger now, mixed with raw, unfiltered desperation. "You shut your mouth," he yelled, the sound echoing off the vinyl siding of my house. "You think you are so smart? You think you can steal my kids and freeze my accounts? You are a bitter, lonely nurse who could never get a life of her own, so you are trying to ruin mine. I am their father. I will call the police right now. I will tell them you kidnapped my sons. I will have you arrested for holding them hostage." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up as a weapon. For decades, this aggression had worked. When Travis screamed, the family cowered. When Travis threatened, the family capitulated. My parents had trained me to absorb his rage and pacify him to bend so the golden child would not break. I did not bend. "Go ahead, Travis," I said, my voice cutting through his screaming like a blade. "Call them. Dial 911. Let us have the Fort Smith police come out to the house. We can show them Toby's rotting teeth. We can show them the canceled insurance policy. We can show them the forged state affidavit you and Dad filed last week." Travis hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen of his phone. The threat of police intervention, usually his trump card, suddenly looked like a trap door. And while we are waiting for the squad car, I continued lifting my hand and pointing a single finger upward toward the corner of the porch ceiling. "You might want to consider how this conversation is going to look to a judge." Travis followed my finger. His eyes locked onto the small black lens of the security camera, its red recording light blinking steadily in the dusk. "You just stood on my porch and admitted you only want to take your children to a country club for a photo op to fix your image," I stated, my words precise and cold. "You threatened to file a false police report for kidnapping, despite the fact that you forged a permanent custody affidavit, placing them in my care. Every word, every threat, every drop of alcohol on your breath is being recorded on a secure cloud server." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn at the steakhouse patio vanished entirely. The golden child's shield shattered. He had charged into my territory expecting the submissive scapegoat he had bullied since childhood. Instead, he found a woman who had meticulously mapped out his destruction. He was outplayed, outmaneuvered, and caught on tape. Travis lowered his phone. His chest heaved, his breath coming in ragged, angry bursts. He looked at the camera, then back down at me. The bravado evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, cornered coward. He took a step back, retreating toward the edge of the porch. "You are crazy," he muttered, but the words lacked conviction. "You are out of your mind, Roz." He turned and practically ran down the walkway, fleeing the unblinking eye of the camera. He yanked open the door of his heavy truck and climbed into the driver's seat. Before pulling the door shut, he leaned out, his face twisted in a final, desperate attempt to reclaim control. "You think you won because of a camera?" he sneered, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "Mom and Dad are handling you this Sunday. You are done, Roz, you hear me? You are completely done." He slammed the door, threw the truck into reverse, and tore out of the driveway, the tires squealing against the asphalt as he sped away, fleeing the consequences he could no longer outrun. I stood on the porch watching the red glow of his taillights disappear down the street. The heavy humidity settled back over the neighborhood, the silence returning. I did not feel fear. The threat of a family showdown on Sunday did not make me panic. Instead, I felt a deep, profound clarity. My brother was panicking. His stolen funds were frozen. His public image was rotting. He was terrified, retreating behind the protective skirt of our parents to save him from the mess he had created. The power dynamic had fully shifted. They thought they were setting a trap for me this weekend. They had no idea they were building the stage for their own execution. The echo of Travis's screeching tires faded into the thick Arkansas evening, leaving behind a heavy, humid silence. I stood on my porch, my hand resting on the wooden railing, my heart beating with a steady rhythmic adrenaline. The confrontation had been ugly raw and terrifyingly real. For a moment, the old conditioned panic flared in my chest, the familiar dread of causing a scene of drawing unwanted attention to the Pruitt family name. But that fear evaporated when I heard the distinct, measured crunch of boots on gravel. I turned my head. Walking across the property line that separated my driveway from the adjacent yard was my next-door neighbor, Arthur Miller. Miller was a fixture in our quiet neighborhood. A retired county sheriff's deputy in his late 60s, he carried himself with the deliberate, watchful posture of a man who had spent 40 years interpreting human behavior. He spent his days tending to a meticulous vegetable garden and restoring a vintage Chevrolet in his garage. In the 5 years I had lived next door, our interactions had been pleasant but brief. A wave over the fence, a quick conversation about the weather, or the occasional exchange of surplus tomatoes. He knew my routine. He knew I was a nurse who worked long hours, maintained a quiet home, and never caused trouble. He stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, wiping a smear of engine grease from his hands with a blue shop towel. He was wearing a faded denim shirt and a worn silver belt buckle. Miller did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer empty, polite platitudes. He looked at me with a sharp, discerning gaze. I saw the whole thing, Roz Miller said quietly, folding his arms across his chest. He kept his voice low, a respectful murmur that carried easily in the still evening air. I was out in the garage. The door was up. I heard the truck pull in, and I heard the shouting. My stomach clenched briefly. A core part of the scapegoat's conditioning is the belief that family conflicts are shameful secrets that must be hidden at all costs. Exposing the toxicity to an outsider felt like a dangerous betrayal of the unwritten rules. "I am so sorry for the disturbance, Miller," I said instinctively, falling back into my habit of apologizing for my brother's behavior. He is going through a difficult time. I did not mean for it to spill out into the street." Miller raised a single calloused hand, stopping my apology before it could gain momentum. "Do not apologize for another man's foolishness, Roz," he said, his tone shifting into a gentle but firm reprimand. "I spent 4 decades wearing a badge. I know the difference between a man having a hard time and a man trying to bully his way out of a corner. I heard what he said to you. I heard the threats." He took a step closer, resting his boot on the bottom stair. "I know your father," Miller continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Gary Pruitt likes to throw his weight around town. He thinks a fat wallet and a country club membership make a man untouchable. But I also know you. I have watched you go to work at 5 in the morning for years. I have watched you bring those 2 little boys into your home this past week and care for them." The validation was unexpected and profound. My parents had spent decades constructing a narrative where they were the benevolent, flawless pillars of society, and I was the flawed, inadequate disappointment. They relied on their money to purchase respect. Miller was standing on my lawn, actively rejecting that narrative. He was looking at the reality of my actions, measuring my quiet consistency against my brother's loud, drunken aggression, and making a definitive judgment. "If that boy comes back here threatening you again," Miller said, his voice dropping into a register of ironclad certainty, "or if Gary Pruitt tries to use his connections to intimidate you, you let me know. You do not have to fight them alone. If you ever need a witness, you call me. I know a lot of judges in this county who do not play golf with your father." The magnitude of his offer settled over me like a protective blanket. "Thank you, Miller," I whispered, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "I might just take you up on that." He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked back across the lawn toward his garage, the blue shop towel swinging from his back pocket. I watched him go, a profound realization taking root in my mind. The power dynamic had shifted in a way I had not fully anticipated. When I exposed the boy's medical condition to Dr. Evans at the clinic, I had fractured my family's pristine reputation within the elite professional circles of Fort Smith. When Margaret Evans sat next to me at church, she had fractured their standing within their religious community. Now, standing on my porch, I understood that the fracture had spread to my own neighborhood. The secrets were bleeding out. My parents' greatest weakness was their absolute, consuming obsession with their public image. They had built an empire on the illusion of perfection, controlling the narrative by ensuring the truth never leaked outside the walls of their Hot Springs estate. They assumed they could isolate me, bully me, and silence me because I had no social currency of my own. They failed to understand that quiet consistency builds its own kind of currency. I was not the isolated, helpless scapegoat cowering in the shadow of my wealthy parents. I was a respected, protected member of my town. My neighbor, a retired law enforcement officer, had just volunteered to stand as a witness against my family. The local doctor was holding medical charts, ready to testify on my behalf. The church elders were beginning to look at my parents with suspicion. The community was actively turning against the Pruitt family to protect me and the boys. My parents believed their money could buy an impenetrable fortress. But I was building a wall of social support around Leo and Toby that Gary's money could not penetrate. The town was seeing the truth, and they were choosing a side. I turned and walked back inside my house, locking the door behind me. The living room was quiet. The television was playing softly. Leo and Toby were sitting on the floor constructing a small, colorful fort out of plastic blocks. Toby looked up as I entered the room. The fear that had clouded his eyes for days was beginning to recede, replaced by a cautious, fragile trust. I sat down on the sofa, pulling my phone from my pocket. Travis's parting words echoed in my mind. "Mom and Dad are handling you this Sunday. You are done." He was right about one thing. A confrontation was coming. The phone call with Gary, the medical audit, and the porch incident had pushed my parents into a corner. They were desperate to regain control of the narrative before the whispers tore their reputation completely apart. They would attempt one final, massive play to force me back into submission and silence the scandal. But they were preparing to fight the daughter I used to be. They were expecting the frightened, compliant woman who would weep and sign whatever document they pushed across the table to keep the peace. They did not know that the woman walking into their Hot Springs estate on Sunday would be flanked by an invisible army. They did not know that their secrets were already in the hands of the medical board, the state caseworkers, and the local authorities. They did not know that the community they so desperately wanted to impress had already judged them and found them guilty. I looked at the boys safe and quiet in my living room. I would go to the Sunday dinner. I would let them set their trap. And then I would spring it. The call came at 9:15 on Wednesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling next to my hand. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, deep breath to steady my heart rate. I picked up the phone, pressed accept, and did not say a word. "Roz, sweetheart." My mother's voice floated through the speaker, dripping with a sickly sweet, artificial warmth. "Good morning." The tone was jarring. 2 days ago, Brenda Pruitt had posted a public passive-aggressive manifesto on Facebook questioning my capacity for maternal sacrifice and painting me as a bitter, childless villain. Now she was speaking to me with the gentle, coaxing cadence she usually reserved for the country club ladies' auxiliary. The whiplash was a classic tactic. When the smear campaign failed to break my silence, and when Travis's aggressive ambush on my porch resulted in a humiliating retreat, my parents realized they had lost the advantage of intimidation. They were shifting strategies. They were deploying the velvet glove. "Good morning, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice flat and neutral. "I know things have been tense this week." Brenda continued, her voice fluttering with practiced concern. "Emotions are running high. Travis is just so overwhelmed with his grief, and your father is under a lot of pressure at the firm. We have all said things we regret, but we are a family, Roz. Family sticks together when things get hard." I stared at the wood grain of my kitchen table. She was attempting to sweep the forged state affidavit, the stolen trust funds, and the medical neglect under the rug of tense emotions. It was a staggering display of cognitive dissonance. "Your father and I were talking last night," Brenda said, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial, intimate register. "We do not want this silliness to drive a wedge between us. We want to work things out and be a family again. We are hosting a mandatory family dinner this Sunday at the house in Hot Springs. I am making my famous pot roast. We want you to come, just you, so we can talk like adults." I narrowed my eyes. A mandatory family dinner. In the Pruitt family dinners were never just meals. They were carefully staged productions, where Gary handed down edicts and expected total compliance. "I am working a lot of shifts, Mom," I said, playing the reluctant, overwhelmed daughter. "I'm not sure I have the time to drive all the way to Hot Springs just for dinner." "Oh, it will not take long," Brenda countered quickly, the urgency bleeding through her sweet facade. "And we really do need you there, Roz. Travis brought over some paperwork for the boys, just some standard school waivers and medical consent forms. The state needs them finalized so you can enroll Leo and Toby in the local district. Your father had his lawyer draft them up to make everything official and easy for you. You just need to swing by and sign them." The trap snapped shut in my mind. Standard school waivers. My parents were not seeking reconciliation. They were in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. The medical audit Dr. Evans triggered had frozen the survivor benefits. The phone call where I confronted Gary about the forged affidavit had confirmed that their massive financial fraud was exposed. They knew the state investigators would soon be knocking on their door, asking why the legal financial trustees were living in luxury while the children were malnourished and uninsured. They needed a firewall. The standard waivers Brenda was so desperate for me to sign were undoubtedly retroactive liability releases. Gary had likely paid his expensive Hot Springs lawyer to draft an ironclad indemnification form. The document would legally stipulate that I, Rosalind Pruitt, assumed full retroactive financial and physical responsibility for the boys from the moment they entered my home. It would state that I was aware of their condition and accepted the burden, effectively absolving Gary and Travis of any prior neglect or financial mismanagement. If I signed that paper, I would become the permanent legal scapegoat. Gary and Travis would take the document to the state investigator, claiming I had eagerly taken the boys and that any missing funds were the result of my own poor management. They would walk away clean, keeping the $400,000 settlement, while I would be left to face the criminal consequences of their neglect. They were inviting me to a dinner party to politely ask me to sign my own death warrant. "I understand, Mom," I said slowly, injecting just enough hesitation into my voice to make her believe I was bending to her will. "If it is just to clear up the paperwork for the boys' school, I can make that work." "Oh, wonderful," Brenda exclaimed, the relief in her voice genuine and immediate. She thought she had won. She thought the obedient, easily manipulated daughter had returned. "We will see you at 5 on Sunday, sweetheart. It will be so nice to have everyone together again." She hung up before I could ask any further questions, sealing the commitment. I lowered the phone and let out a long, shaky breath. The sheer malice of their plan was suffocating. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom, my nursing license, and my entire future to protect Travis's access to a stolen inheritance. They viewed me not as a daughter, but as a utility, a human shield to be discarded the moment the consequences of their greed caught up with them. The conflict was escalating rapidly. I was no longer just protecting the boys, I was fighting for my own survival. I spent the next 3 days preparing to walk directly into the lion's den. I did not hire a lawyer. I did not want a legal representative to intercept the conflict and handle it through sterile, formal letters. A lawyer would alert Gary's counsel, initiating a prolonged bureaucratic standoff where my father's wealth could drag the process out for years. I needed to break their power completely, and I needed to do it in front of the very people they relied on to maintain their illusion. I went to the local print shop on Thursday afternoon. I handed the clerk a USB drive and asked him to print several documents on high-quality, heavy stock paper. First, I printed the comprehensive medical charts Dr. Evans had signed and sealed, detailing the advanced dental decay, the untreated asthma, and the severe malnutrition. Second, I printed the screenshot of the State Health Registry network showing that Travis had canceled the boys' health insurance 6 months prior for non-payment. Third, I printed the digital transcript of the audio recording I had captured on my phone. The transcript detailed Gary's exact threats, his plan to falsely declare me mentally unstable, and his explicit threat to throw his own grandsons into the state foster system to punish me for exposing his fraud. Finally, I printed the screenshots of the vicious smear campaign, Aunt Diane's text accusing me of extortion, Cousin Paul's message questioning my sanity, and Brenda's highly public Facebook post attempting to destroy my reputation. I placed all the documents into a sleek black leather portfolio. It was not a binder of random complaints. It was a curated, devastating dossier of fraud, child endangerment, and witness intimidation. My parents thought they were setting a trap for a naive, frightened woman. They believed they could isolate me in their massive Hot Springs home, surround me with the aggressive, judgmental glare of the extended family, and pressure me into signing away my life to save their golden boy. They had no idea that the woman driving to Hot Springs on Sunday would not be bringing a pen. I was accepting the invitation to their grand performative family dinner. I was going to play the part of the submissive daughter one last time, allowing them to gather all their flying monkeys into one room. I would let Gary stand at the head of the table and deliver his condescending speech. I would let them lay their fraudulent trap right out in the open. And then I was going to use their own stage to execute their absolute permanent destruction. Sunday afternoon arrived with a heavy, oppressive stillness. The humid Arkansas air seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the break in the weather. Inside my small, quiet house in Fort Smith, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was the calm before the storm, but for the first time in my life, I was not the one bracing for impact. I stood at the kitchen stove, carefully flipping a grilled cheese sandwich in a cast-iron skillet. The smell of melting butter and toasted bread filled the room. I had specifically chosen soft, easy-to-chew white bread for Toby, ensuring his teeth would not ache. Leo sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs, watching me with wide, observant eyes. I slid the sandwich onto a paper plate, cut it down the middle, and set it in front of the 6-year-old. "Be careful, Toby," I said gently, tapping the edge of the plate. "It is a little hot. Take small bites." Toby picked up a half, blowing on it cautiously before taking a tiny, tentative nibble. When no sharp pain followed, his entire body relaxed. He offered me a small, sticky smile, a rare expression that made my chest tighten with a fierce, protective ache. Leo was working on a puzzle I had bought him, fitting a large cardboard piece into place. He looked up, his brow furrowed with a worry that was entirely too heavy for an 8-year-old. "Are you going to see our dad today?" Aunt Roz Leo asked. His voice was quiet, lacking any of the eager anticipation a child should feel when asking about their father. I dried my hands on a dish towel and pulled out a chair sitting directly across from him. I wanted to be at eye level. "I am going to see him, Leo," I answered, keeping my tone steady and reassuring. "I am going to have a talk with your dad and your grandparents." Leo looked down at the puzzle piece in his hand, his small fingers tracing the cardboard edge. Is he going to make us go back?" The fear in his question was a physical blow. Travis had lived a life of unearned luxury, driving custom trucks and buying speedboats, yet the only thing he had successfully instilled in his children was a profound, lingering terror. My family viewed these boys as a financial asset to be drained and a physical burden to be discarded. They were parasites feeding off the vulnerability of grieving children to sustain their polished, wealthy facade. I reached across the table and placed my hand over Leo's. "Look at me, Leo," I said, my voice firm, leaving absolutely no room for doubt. "You are safe here. You and Toby are not going anywhere. You are going to stay with me, and I am going to make sure nobody ever makes you feel scared or hungry again. Do you understand?" Leo stared into my eyes for a long moment, searching for the lie. When he found only truth, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He placed the puzzle piece into its spot and went back to his work, the tension slowly draining from his small shoulders. At 3 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It was Maria, a senior nurse from the family practice clinic. Maria was a no-nonsense, deeply practical woman who had raised 4 children of her own. She knew exactly what I was walking into. I had not given her the full ugly details of the financial fraud, but I had told her enough. She knew my family was attempting a hostile legal maneuver, and she knew I needed an ironclad alibi for the boys while I handled it. "I packed some snacks for them," Maria said, holding up a canvas tote bag as she stepped into the entryway. "We are going to build a blanket fort in the living room and watch movies until you get back. Take your time, Roz. Handle your business. I hugged her, a deep, silent gratitude passing between us. I was ensuring Leo and Toby were completely insulated far away from the blast radius of the collision that was about to occur in Hot Springs. I walked down the hall to my bedroom to get ready. For 46 years, attending a dinner at Gary and Brenda Pruitt's estate required a specific uniform. It required uncomfortable, expensive shoes, conservative dresses, and carefully applied makeup. It was a performance of submission, a physical demonstration that you respected their wealth and adhered to their strict aesthetic standards. You dressed to impress Gary, or you suffered his cutting, subtle insults for the rest of the evening. I opened my closet doors. I bypassed the row of modest, acceptable dresses I kept specifically for Sunday dinners. Instead, I reached for my work uniform. I pulled out a pair of crisp, dark navy nursing scrubs. They were practical, utilitarian, and designed for a woman who spent 12 hours a day on her feet handling the messy physical realities of life and death. I slipped them on, tying the drawstring tight at my waist. I stepped into my worn, supportive nursing clogs. I pulled my hair back into a tight, efficient ponytail, applying no makeup. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the frightened, people-pleasing scapegoat who used to agonize over whether her dress was formal enough for her mother's approval. The woman in the mirror was a licensed medical professional. She was a woman who documented neglect, who stood up to aggressive men on her front porch, and who had spent the last week meticulously building a case that would destroy a powerful, corrupt patriarch. The scrubs were my professional armor. They were a visual rejection of my parents' performative gala. I was not attending a family dinner to be evaluated. I was showing up for a shift to excise a malignant rot. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and the sleek black leather portfolio resting on my nightstand. The portfolio held Dr. Evans's certified medical charts, the canceled insurance records, the audio transcript of Gary's threats, and the screenshots of the smear campaign. It was heavy with undeniable truth. I walked out to my car and started the hour-long drive south toward Hot Springs. The highway wound through the rolling pine-covered hills of the Ouachita Mountains. The scenery was beautiful, a lush green testament to the Arkansas landscape, but I barely registered it. My mind was sharp-focused entirely on the strategic moves ahead. Gary and Brenda had called this dinner a mandatory family meeting. They claimed it was a chance to work things out and sign some standard school waivers. I knew exactly what kind of trap they had set. Gary, anticipating the impending state fraud investigation triggered by the medical audit, needed a legal scapegoat. He had undoubtedly used his expensive Hot Springs lawyer to draft retroactive liability releases. These documents would stipulate that I willingly assumed full physical and financial responsibility for the boys, effectively absolving him and Travis of any prior neglect or mismanagement of the trust funds. He had invited the extended family, the very aunts and cousins, who had participated in the vicious text message smear campaign, to apply maximum social pressure. Gary intended to sit at the head of his mahogany table, surrounded by his loyal enablers, and publicly demand my submission. He believed that the combined weight of the family's judgment, coupled with the intimidating atmosphere of his massive estate, would force me to break. He expected me to cry, apologize for causing trouble, and hastily sign the papers just to escape the agonizing humiliation. He was relying on a power dynamic that no longer existed. I turned off the main highway, navigating the winding, manicured roads that led into the exclusive gated communities surrounding Lake Hamilton. The houses grew larger and more ostentatious, with every mile sprawling estates hidden behind tall iron fences and lush imported landscaping. I pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates of my parents' property. The keypad sat on a stone pillar. I punched in the entry code. The heavy gates swung open smoothly, granting me access to the fortress they believed made them untouchable. I drove up the long, sweeping, circular driveway. The estate was massive, a multi-level stone and glass mansion overlooking the water. Several expensive cars were already parked near the expansive garages. Aunt Diane's pristine SUV, Cousin Paul's shiny new sedan, and parked prominently near the front entrance, gleaming in the late afternoon sun, was Travis's custom-lifted Ford truck. The flying monkeys had assembled. The stage was set. I parked my 10-year-old sedan at the edge of the driveway, a stark, practical contrast to the surrounding luxury vehicles. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet of the cab for one final moment. I placed my hand flat against the black leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat. My pulse was steady. My hands were not shaking. I felt a profound, absolute calm. I picked up the portfolio, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the heavy custom-carved wooden front doors. I was ready to step into the lion's den, not as prey, but as the executioner of my family's toxic legacy. I pushed open the heavy front doors of the Hot Springs estate. The expansive foyer with its vaulted ceiling and sweeping double staircase smelled faintly of expensive floor wax and roasting meat. The low murmur of conversation and the clinking of crystal drifted out from the formal dining room down the hall. I did not pause to announce my arrival. I walked straight down the wide marble-tiled corridor, my rubber-soled nursing clogs squeaking softly against the polished stone. When I stepped through the arched doorway into the dining room, the scale of my parents' ambush was fully visible. The custom mahogany table was extended to its maximum length. 15 extended family members were seated around it. The very people who had spent the last week actively participating in the vicious text message smear campaign and leaving passive-aggressive comments on my mother's Facebook post were now gathered sipping dark red wine from delicate, long-stemmed glasses. Aunt Diane sat near the middle wearing a stiff blazer. Cousin Paul sat across from her scrolling idly on his phone. My mother Brenda was positioned at the far end, looking the picture of aggrieved maternal grace in a silk blouse. And seated prominently near the head of the table, looking incredibly uncomfortable in a collared shirt, was Travis. Gary stood at the head of the table holding court. He had a glass of scotch in one hand, gesturing broadly with the other as he recounted a story to Uncle Robert. He was puffing his chest out, fully embracing his role as the benevolent, powerful patriarch. When I crossed the threshold, the conversation died instantly. 15 heads turned toward me. The abrupt silence in the dining room was dense and suffocating, the kind of absolute quiet that precedes a highly anticipated execution. They looked at me, taking in my appearance. They expected me to arrive wearing an uncomfortable dress, shrinking into myself, eager to apologize for causing a disruption. Instead, they saw a woman standing tall in dark navy nursing scrubs, her hair pulled back into a severe ponytail, carrying a thick black leather portfolio under her arm. The judgmental stares were palpable. Aunt Diane's lip curled into a visible sneer of disapproval. Cousin Paul let out a low, scoffing breath. Brenda's eyes narrowed, offended by my visual rejection of their performative gala. They saw the scrubs as a sign of disrespect, a deliberate insult to the formal setting. Gary set his scotch glass down on the mahogany table with a heavy, deliberate thud. He offered a tight, condescending smile that did not reach his eyes. "Roz," he said, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced resonance of a man accustomed to commanding a room. "So glad you could finally join us. Please have a seat." He gestured to the single empty chair positioned directly next to him. It was a strategic placement. He wanted me close, isolated from the rest of the table, physically trapped under his direct authority. I walked over and stood behind the chair. I did not sit down. I rested the black leather portfolio flat on the table in front of me, keeping my hands resting lightly on the cover. "We were just talking about how difficult this past week has been for everyone," Gary continued, leaning forward and resting his palms on the polished wood. He was delivering a prepared speech carefully crafted for the audience of flying monkeys surrounding us. "Travis has been under a tremendous amount of stress, being a single father after such a tragic loss. It takes a toll. He made some impulsive decisions, but his heart is in the right place." Travis stared down at his empty plate, nodding solemnly, playing the part of the grieving, overwhelmed widower to perfection. "And you," Roz Gary said, shifting his gaze to me. His voice dropped into a patronizing, pitying register. "We know you are confused. You are overwhelmed. You live a very quiet, simple life, and suddenly having 2 young boys in your home is a lot to handle. We understand that you panicked. We understand that you said some things out of fear. But we are a family, and family forgives." He was rewriting history in real time. He was framing my discovery of the forged affidavit and the stolen trust funds as a hysterical, irrational panic attack caused by my inability to handle childcare. He was positioning himself as the forgiving father, magnanimously offering to guide his erratic daughter back to sanity. It was a masterful display of narcissistic manipulation designed to cement the family's loyalty to Travis while completely discrediting my reality. Gary reached down into a leather briefcase resting near his feet. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. He slid the stack across the smooth mahogany surface, stopping it right next to my portfolio. "We want to make this easy for you, Roz," Gary stated smoothly, tapping the top page of the documents. "Travis realizes he needs some significant time to heal. He wants the boys to stay with you in a stable environment. These papers simply clear up the state paperwork. It makes your guardianship official so you can enroll them in school and handle their medical needs without any bureaucratic hassle." I looked down at the documents. I did not need to read the fine print to know exactly what they were. They were the retroactive liability releases drafted by his expensive Hot Springs lawyer. They were designed to legally stipulate that I willingly assumed full physical and financial responsibility for the boys, effectively shielding Gary and Travis from the impending state fraud investigation. "Just sign these." Roz, Gary demanded, his tone hardening slightly, losing an edge of this benevolent act. "It puts all this ugly business behind us. We can move forward as a family." The social pressure immediately intensified. The flying monkeys surrounding the table took their cues. "Do the right thing," Roz, Aunt Diane, chimed in from the middle of the table, glaring at me with self-righteous authority. "Travis has sacrificed enough. Stop making this so difficult for your parents." "Yeah, Roz," Cousin Paul added, crossing his arms over his chest. "Dad said you have been acting completely unhinged. Just sign the papers and let everyone have some peace." Even Brenda leaned forward from the far end of the table, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We just want to help you, sweetheart. We just want the boys to be safe." They were attempting to crush me under the combined weight of their collective judgment. They expected me to break. They expected me to pick up the expensive fountain pen resting next to the documents, scrawl my name on the dotted line, and legally accept the burden of my brother's crimes, just to escape the agonizing humiliation of standing alone against the entire family. I looked around the table. I saw 15 people who had spent their entire lives bowing to Gary's wealth, eagerly trading the truth for invitations to his lake house and access to his country club. I looked at Travis, the golden child who had canceled his children's health insurance to buy a boat, sitting there pretending to be a victim. And then I looked at Gary, the man who had threatened to throw his own grandsons into the state foster system to protect his unearned power. The fear that used to paralyze me in this room was completely gone. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical certainty. I did not reach for the pen. I did not cry. I placed my hands flat on the cover of the black leather portfolio. "I don't sign forged documents, Dad," I stated. My voice was not loud, but it was deadpan clinical and sharp enough to cut glass. It sliced through the tense silence of the dining room, a blunt, undeniable rejection of the entire performance. The immediate reaction was profound confusion. Aunt Diane's mouth opened slightly. Cousin Paul uncrossed his arms. They did not understand the word forged. It was not part of the script Gary had provided them. Gary's patronizing smile vanished instantly. A dangerous dark flush crept up his neck. "What did you just say to me?" he hissed, his voice, dropping the benevolent act, entirely revealing the vicious predator beneath. I flipped open the cover of the portfolio. "I am not confused, Gary," I said, addressing him by his first name, shattering the hierarchical boundary. "I am not overwhelmed, and I am not signing a retroactive liability release to save you and Travis from a state fraud investigation." I pulled out the first document. It was a high-resolution copy of the notarized state affidavit they had filed the previous week. I slid it across the table, right on top of Gary's thick stack of legal papers. "Travis dropped his sons on my porch last Friday and told me he needed a weekend to clear his head," I announced to the room, my voice carrying clearly to the farthest end of the long table. But the state caseworker called me on Monday. Travis, Gary, and Brenda filed this permanent kinship affidavit on Thursday afternoon, 24 hours before he even pulled into my driveway. I tapped the bottom of the page, "and they forged my signature to do it," I declared. A murmur rippled through the extended family. Uncle Robert leaned forward, squinting at the document on the table. Aunt Diane looked at Gary, waiting for him to immediately dismiss the accusation. Gary slammed his hand flat on the mahogany table, the loud crack echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You are a liar!" he roared, his face twisting with rage. "You are a hysterical, bitter spinster making up insane stories because you are jealous of your brother. I told everyone you were losing your mind." He expected the volume of his rage to silence me. He expected me to retreat. I did not flinch. I pulled the next stack of papers from the portfolio. It was the comprehensive medical charts stamped and signed by Dr. Evans. I tossed them onto the table. They fanned out, exposing the stark clinical documentation of prolonged abuse. "I am not lying," I stated, staring directly at Travis. "I took Leo and Toby to Dr. Evans at the clinic this week. These are the certified medical charts. They document severe malnutrition, untreated asthma, and advanced dental rot down to the nerve." Travis visibly recoiled, sinking lower into his chair, his eyes darting toward the exit. And when Dr. Evans tried to run their insurance, I continued, my voice rising in volume and authority, pinning Travis to his seat. "We found out the policy was canceled 6 months ago for non-payment." The murmurs in the room escalated into shocked gasps. Forging a signature was an abstract legal concept to the extended family, but severe medical neglect and canceled insurance policies were tangible, visceral horrors that shattered the illusion of the grieving, devoted father. Gary pointed a shaking finger at me. "You shut your mouth right now, Roz," he commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and rising panic. "I am warning you." I ignored him entirely. I pulled the final devastating piece of evidence from the portfolio, the printout detailing the trust fund accounts. "I know about the $400,000 wrongful death settlement, Travis," I said, dropping the paper onto the center of the table. "I know that you and Gary are the financial trustees. I know you receive $1,500 a month in state survivor benefits meant to feed and clothe those boys." The absolute silence returned to the dining room. It was the silence of a bomb dropping the fuse, burning down in real time. "You forged my signature to dump the physical labor and the financial burden of raising those traumatized children entirely on me," I declared, sweeping my gaze across the stunned faces of the aunts and uncles who had sent me abusive texts just days prior. "You did it so you could drain their inheritance without the state investigating the neglect." I looked directly into Gary's furious, panicked eyes. Travis bought a $70,000 custom speedboat with the boys' survivor benefits, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. He bought a luxury boat, while his 6-year-old son slept on my floor in a garbage bag, crying because his rotting teeth hurt too much to eat a piece of bread. The impact of the truth hit the room like a physical shockwave. The polished, flawless veneer of the Pruitt family empire shattered into a million irrecoverable pieces. The trap they had set for me had just become the stage for their own absolute destruction. The mahogany dining table, usually the center of polite conversation and carefully curated family pride, had transformed into a sterile autopsy table. The certified medical charts, the canceled insurance records, and the trust fund printouts lay scattered across the polished wood, dissecting the Pruitt family's meticulously crafted public image. The silence in the room stretched thin and brittle until it finally snapped under the weight of undeniable truth. Aunt Diane, who just days prior had accused me of extorting babysitting money, was the first to react. She looked from the printed medical charts detailing Toby's rotting teeth to Travis, who was staring fixedly at his empty wine glass. The physical revulsion on her face was immediate. She actually shifted her chair physically, recoiling away from the golden child she had spent decades defending. Travis' Uncle Robert's voice was low, thick with a rising, disbelieving anger. "Is this true? Did you cancel those boys' health insurance?" Travis opened his mouth, but no words came out. The slick, confident charm he used to navigate every crisis in his life evaporated. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting frantically toward Gary, silently begging his father to fix the mess, to deploy the wealth and authority that had always shielded him from consequences. Gary Pruitt was not looking at Travis. He was looking at the documents on the table with a terrifying, wild desperation. The foundation of his empire was built on control. He controlled the finances, he controlled the narrative, and he controlled the people. Now, in front of the extended family network he relied upon for social reinforcement, he was bleeding power. "You ungrateful, hysterical bitch, Gary!" roared the sudden volume, making several people at the table flinch. He grabbed the thick stack of retroactive liability releases he had tried to force me to sign and hurled them across the room. The papers scattered over the expensive Persian rug. "You come into my house, you disrespect me, and you spew these insane lies." He stood up his chair, scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at me. "I want you out of my house right now. Roz, get out before I call the police and have you dragged out in handcuffs for trespassing." The threat of police intervention, his usual trump card for asserting dominance, sounded hollow and desperate. "Call them Dad," I replied, my voice steady, cutting through his rage with the precision of a scalpel. "Call the Hot Springs police. In fact, call the county sheriff. I am sure they would love to see the forged state affidavit you filed last Thursday. I am sure they would love to see Dr. Evans's signature on these medical charts." Gary froze. He knew the local authorities. He knew that while he could influence minor zoning disputes or secure favorable tea times at the country club, he could not bury a felony forgery charge backed by certified medical evidence of severe child abuse. "You think you are so smart?" Gary sneered, his voice dropping into a vicious, ragged hiss. "You think bringing a few papers to a family dinner changes anything? I have the best lawyers in the state on retainer. I will bury you in litigation. I will tie you up in court for years until you are bankrupt, and I will take those boys back just to prove a point." He was escalating, attempting to reassert his dominance through sheer financial terror. It was a strategy that had kept the extended family in line for 40 years. But I had not come to the dinner unprepared. I had anticipated his escalation. "You are going to need those expensive lawyers, Gary," I stated, stepping back from the table and crossing my arms. "But they are not going to be fighting me in family court." I reached into the pocket of my nursing scrubs. I did not pull out another document. I pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and tapped the audio application icon. On Wednesday, I said addressing the entire room, but keeping my eyes locked on my father, I called Dad to ask about Toby's dental bills. I recorded the conversation. Gary's mottled face suddenly drained of color, turning a sickly pale gray. I pressed play and turned the volume up to maximum. The tinny, unmistakable voice of Gary Pruitt filled the silent dining room. "If you push me, Roz." The recorded voice hissed the malice clear and unvarnished. "I will have those boys thrown into the state foster system by the end of the week. They will be separated. They will end up in group homes, and you will never see them again. Keep your mouth shut and do what women in this family do." I stopped the recording. The shockwave that hit the room was physical. The flying monkeys, the aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had believed Gary was a benevolent patriarch trying to hold a grieving family together, had just heard him explicitly threaten to throw his own flesh and blood into the foster care system simply to protect stolen money and punish his daughter. The mask had slipped, exposing the ruthless, predatory nature of his control. Cousin Paul, who had texted me to call me unhinged, was staring at Gary with wide, horrified eyes. Even Brenda, who had enabled Gary for decades, sat frozen at the end of the table, her hands covering her mouth, finally realizing that the damage could not be smoothed over with a church donation or a passive-aggressive Facebook post. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. "I did not keep my mouth shut, Gary," I said quietly. I placed my hands on the back of the empty chair he had intended to use as a trap. "I did not just bring these documents to a family dinner," I announced to the paralyzed room. "Yesterday afternoon, I handed over the forged state affidavit, the canceled insurance records, and a copy of that audio recording to the state attorney general's office." Travis let out a sharp, breathless gasp, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath him. I also sent the complete file to the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. I continued my voice unwavering, dismantling their escape routes one by one. Dr. Evans triggered a formal medical audit last week, which froze the survivor benefit direct deposits. The state fraud investigators have already pulled the financial records for the Shell LLC you set up to drain the wrongful death settlement. Gary stumbled backward, his knees hitting the seat of his chair. He practically collapsed into it, the aggressive, roaring patriarch replaced by a man realizing he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. "The money is gone, Travis," I said, turning my gaze back to my brother, who was trembling visibly. "The state froze the trust accounts on Friday afternoon. That is why your latest check bounced. That is why you were so desperate to get the boys back for a country club photo op. You needed to prove they were in your care to get the accounts unfrozen." Travis buried his face in his hands, a pathetic, broken image of the golden boy who had finally run out of second chances. "You are going to prison, Travis." I stated the clinical reality of the situation, leaving no room for argument. "And Dad, you are going to be indicted for conspiracy and felony forgery." The silence that followed was not the tense, anticipated quiet of an ambush. It was the absolute, devastating silence of total ruin. The Pruitt family empire, built on decades of deceit, financial manipulation, and cruel favoritism, was burning to the ground right in front of them. Gary did not yell. He did not threaten to call the police. He sat in his chair, staring blankly at the scattered medical charts on the table, surrounded by an extended family that was actively physically distancing themselves from him. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been permanently destroyed. The trap they had set for me had successfully triggered, but they were the ones caught in the steel jaws. I had accomplished exactly what I came to do. I had excised the malignant rot. I reached down and picked up the empty black leather portfolio. I did not bother collecting the documents. They belonged to the wreckage now. I turned away from the mahogany table and walked out of the formal dining room. My rubber-soled nursing clogs squeaked softly against the marble tiles of the foyer. I pushed open the heavy custom-carved front doors, stepping out into the fading Arkansas twilight. The humid air hit my face, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt clear. I walked down the sweeping circular driveway past Travis's custom-lifted truck and Aunt Diane's pristine SUV to my 10-year-old sedan parked at the edge of the property. I unlocked the car, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I did not look back at the sprawling stone mansion. I put the car in gear and drove through the wrought iron gates, leaving the ruined remains of my family's toxic legacy far behind me in the rearview mirror. I was going home to the only family that mattered now. I backed out through the wrought iron gates of the Hot Springs estate, the heavy metal doors closing behind me with a decisive final click. I merged onto the winding highway leading back to Fort Smith. My phone resting on the passenger seat remained dark and silent. I drove with the windows rolled down, letting the rushing night air clear the stench of expensive scotch and panic from my senses. Back in the dining room I had just left, the implosion was immediate and total. I heard the details later, pieces of the wreckage washing ashore through the small-town grapevine, but the reality of their destruction required no embellishment. The moment the front door shut behind me, the spell Gary Pruitt had held over his extended family for 40 years shattered. The undeniable medical records, the canceled insurance documents, and the horrifying audio recording stripped away the protective veneer of wealth and status. Aunt Diane, the woman who had eagerly sent me vicious texts accusing me of extortion, was the first to fracture the alliance. She physically pushed her chair away from the table, staring at Travis as if he were a rabid animal. "You bought a boat," she whispered, the words coming out sharp and revulsed. Her gaze darted to the medical charts detailing Toby's rotting teeth still resting on the polished mahogany. "You let those boys starve to buy a boat. You make me sick." Travis, still buried in his hands, offered no defense. His silence was an admission of guilt, a pathetic confirmation of every accusation I had leveled. The golden child, stripped of his unearned glory, was finally exposed as nothing more than a parasite. Gary attempted to mount a defense, a desperate, roaring attempt to reclaim the dominant narrative. He slammed his fist against the table again, ordering his sister to shut her mouth, claiming the state investigation was a bureaucratic misunderstanding that his lawyers would quickly resolve. He demanded loyalty. He demanded that they remember who paid for the lavish dinners, who provided the business connections, and who held the power in Hot Springs. But his power was entirely gone. The community pressure, the undeniable truth of his own recorded voice, threatening to throw his grandsons into the foster system, had breached the impenetrable walls of his estate. Cousin Paul stood up, dropping his linen napkin onto his plate. He did not ask for permission to leave. He simply turned and walked toward the foyer. Uncle Robert followed, offering no polite goodbye, just a disgusted shake of his head. Within minutes, the grand performative family dinner dissolved into a chaotic, fractured exodus. The flying monkeys were fleeing the sinking ship, frantic to distance themselves from the radioactive taint of felony fraud and child abuse. Brenda remained seated at the far end of the table, entirely alone, staring at the scattered documents that marked the end of her pristine social reign. Over the next few weeks, the consequences of my calculated exposure were swift, brutal, and profoundly public. The state investigators, armed with the evidence I provided, and the medical chart signed by Dr. Evans, moved with terrifying efficiency. The climax of Travis's unearned, lavish lifestyle occurred exactly where he had intended to flaunt it. On a sunny Thursday afternoon, Travis was sitting in the main dining room of the Hardscrabble Country Club, finishing a plate of seared scallops. The room was crowded with local politicians, business owners, and prominent Fort Smith figures. 2 unmarked sedans pulled up to the front entrance. 3 state investigators, accompanied by 2 uniformed Fort Smith police officers, walked directly past the hostess stand, ignoring protests about the dress code. They crossed the busy dining room floor and stopped at Travis's table. They did not ask him to step outside quietly. They did not afford him the dignity of a private conversation. In front of the town's elite, the very people Travis was desperate to impress with his new designer watch and luxury boat stories, the lead investigator read the charges aloud. Felony Medicaid fraud, wire fraud, child endangerment. The country club fell completely silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Travis Pruitt, the golden boy who had never faced a consequence in his life, was handcuffed in the middle of his expensive lunch. The officers marched him out through the dining room past the staring, shocked faces of the community. The public humiliation was absolute. The arrest became the leading gossip in Fort Smith before the police cruiser even reached the station. Gary's destruction took a different, though equally devastating path. The state attorney general's office officially indicted him for conspiracy to commit fraud and felony forgery related to the state custody affidavit. The news hit the Hot Springs business community like a localized earthquake. Gary Pruitt's reputation, built meticulously over decades on the foundation of wealth and presumed moral superiority, disintegrated overnight. The men who used to eagerly accept his golf invitations stopped returning his calls. The banks that held his commercial real estate loans initiated rigorous, aggressive audits of his properties. The social death blow came exactly 10 days after the dinner. The Hot Springs Chamber of Commerce and the local hospital auxiliary board organizations Gary had used to launder his image and project power publicly requested his immediate resignation. They cited the pending legal matters and a commitment to community ethics. Gary was forced to step down in disgrace, his name scrubbed from the letterheads and plaques he so deeply cherished. He was no longer a powerful patriarch. He was a pariah isolated in a sprawling, empty mansion, waiting for a trial that promised to bankrupt him. As the reality of the legal and social fallout settled over the extended family, the panic set in. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly participated in Brenda's smear campaign realized the magnitude of their error. They had backed the wrong side, and now the truth was public record. My phone, which had been silent on the drive home, soon began to vibrate with a familiar, desperate rhythm. Aunt Diane called me first. I let it go to voicemail. 2 hours later, a long, rambling text message arrived. Roz, I am so sorry. I had no idea what Gary and Travis were really doing. They lied to me. I feel terrible about what I said to you. Please let's get coffee and talk. I want to see the boys and help out however I can. We are still family." Cousin Paul followed suit, leaving a frantic voicemail, attempting to excuse his behavior, claiming Gary had manipulated him and that he had always suspected something was wrong. The sudden influx of apologies was not driven by genuine remorse. They were not sorry for the vicious, cruel things they had said when they believed I was vulnerable and isolated. They were apologizing because they were terrified. They had seen the state investigators tear Gary's life apart, and they were desperate to ensure I did not possess any evidence that could implicate them in the fraud. They were frantic to attach themselves to the winning side to wash off the stench of Gary's failure by claiming they had been deceived. I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the messages and listening to the voicemails. For 46 years, I would have eagerly accepted their apologies. I would have viewed their panicked overtures as an olive branch, a chance to finally be accepted back into the family fold. I would have believed the lie that family sticks together, and I would have smoothed over their cruelty to maintain the illusion of peace. But I was no longer the frightened people-pleasing scapegoat. I had watched these people enthusiastically participate in my destruction. I had watched them glare at me in church and text me vicious insults to protect Travis's stolen wealth. I picked up my phone. I did not reply to Aunt Diane. I did not return Cousin Paul's voicemail. I did not offer them the absolution they were begging for. I opened the contact settings for each extended family member who had participated in the smear campaign. With methodical, cold precision, I selected the block caller option for every single one. I severed their access to my life, cutting the ties completely and permanently. I refused to ease their guilt. I refused to grant them the comfort of forgiveness. They had chosen their side when they believed Gary held the power, and they would have to live with the consequences of that choice. I set the phone down on the table. The screen went dark, the desperate notifications silenced forever. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the television in the living room, where Leo and Toby were watching a cartoon. The chaos of the Pruitt family, the toxic swirling demands, the gaslighting, the frantic scrambling for status, it was all locked outside my front door. I had built an impenetrable wall around my life, and the lives of my nephews constructed from medical charts, state investigations, and unshakable boundaries. The storm had finally broken, washing the rot away, leaving behind a clean, hard-fought peace. 6 months later. The heat of the Arkansas summer finally broke, replaced by a crisp, sharp autumn chill that swept through the Ouachita Mountains and settled over the river valleys. The leaves on the massive oak trees lining Garrison Avenue turned vibrant shades of rust and gold. It was the third Saturday in October, the weekend of the annual Fort Smith Autumn Festival. The historic downtown streets were blocked off to traffic, transformed into a sprawling, joyful maze of food stalls, local artisan booths, and carnival games. The air smelled of roasting pecans, funnel cake, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. I walked through the crowded festival grounds, the rhythmic pulse of a local bluegrass band playing from a temporary stage, providing a steady, upbeat soundtrack. I was holding Toby's hand in my left, and Leo walked close on my right. The transformation in the boys over the past 6 months was profound. The fearful, silent children who had arrived on my porch clutching plastic trash bags were gone. Toby was laughing a loud, clear sound that carried over the festival noise. The rotting teeth that had caused him so much agony were gone, expertly removed and repaired by the pediatric oral surgeon Dr. Evans had recommended. He could eat a candied apple without a single wince. Leo looked like a different child entirely. He had gained nearly 10 pounds, the sharp angles of his ribs replaced by healthy, solid muscle. The untreated asthma was managed with a daily inhaler, allowing him to run between the carnival games without stopping to gasp for breath. He wore a thick, properly fitting winter coat over his shoulders and a pair of new wire-rimmed glasses that helped him see the world clearly for the first time in years. They were safe. They were healthy. And most importantly, they knew they were fiercely protected. As we navigated the crowded walkway, the reality of my new social standing in Fort Smith was impossible to ignore. We passed a booth selling handmade quilts, and Mrs. Higgins, my neighbor, waved enthusiastically. "Roz," she called out, leaning over her display table. "The boys are looking so handsome today. Bring them by later. I have a batch of sugar cookies fresh out of the oven." I smiled, promising we would stop by before heading home. A few yards down the path, near a bustling cider stand, Dr. Arthur Evans and his wife Margaret were chatting with a group of hospital administrators. When Margaret spotted us, her face lit up with genuine delight. She stepped away from her conversation, walking over to wrap me in a warm, familiar hug. "It is so good to see you all out enjoying the weather," Margaret said, her voice carrying the same strong protective authority she had wielded in the church sanctuary 6 months prior. "Leo, Toby, you two are growing like weeds." Dr. Evans offered a firm, approving nod, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal battle we had fought and won together. I returned the greetings, feeling a deep, solid warmth spread through my chest. The isolation that had defined my life as the family scapegoat was a distant memory. I had built a new foundation constructed not on compliance to a toxic patriarch, but on quiet, unshakable integrity. The community recognized that integrity. They respected the woman who had stood up to Gary Pruitt's wealth and exposed his rot to protect 2 vulnerable children. We were embraced, surrounded by an invisible wall of social support that Gary's money could never breach. We continued toward the center of the festival, aiming for the carnival games set up near the historic courthouse. Toby was fixated on a stall where you threw darts at balloons to win stuffed animals. As we approached the game, the crowd shifted, parting slightly, near a display of antique farm equipment. I stopped walking. Just 20 yards away, standing near a rusted tractor display, were Gary and Brenda Pruitt. I had not seen them since the night I walked out of the Hot Springs dining room. The physical toll of the last 6 months was starkly evident on both of them. Gary looked diminished, a shadow of the roaring, arrogant patriarch who had tried to intimidate me with threats of foster care and expensive lawyers. The tailored charcoal suit he usually wore to community events had been replaced by a wrinkled, ill-fitting jacket. His posture slumped, the aggressive, commanding chest puff gone. He looked old, tired, and deeply defeated. The state attorney general had followed through on the indictments. The felony forgery and conspiracy charges had triggered a cascading financial collapse. The banks had called in their loans, freezing his commercial assets. The Hot Springs mansion was currently tied up in complex litigation, a sprawling monument to his greed slowly draining his remaining wealth in legal fees. Brenda stood beside him, clutching her designer handbag like a shield that no longer offered protection. She was wearing a large pair of sunglasses, attempting to hide her face, but her nervous, darting glances betrayed her panic. They were standing in the middle of a crowded festival in the town they used to control, and they were completely alone. I watched as a prominent city councilman, a man who used to eagerly accept Gary's campaign donations, walked down the path toward them. The councilman made eye contact with Gary for a split second, his expression hardening into a cold, polite blankness. He deliberately altered his course, veering left, toward a food stall to avoid walking past my parents. 2 women from Brenda's former charity auxiliary board passed by a moment later. They did not stop to chat. They did not offer warm greetings. They looked right through Brenda, continuing their conversation without breaking stride, executing a brutal, flawless social freeze-out. The ostracization was complete. The pristine reputation they had spent 50 years cultivating, the illusion of flawless morality they had used to justify destroying my life, was reduced to ashes. The town knew exactly what they had done. They knew Gary had conspired to steal an inheritance from grieving orphans, and they knew Brenda had viciously attacked the daughter who stepped in to save them. The very community they had relied upon for status and power now viewed them with open, undisguised disgust. Gary turned his head, his tired eyes scanning the crowd. His gaze landed on me. He saw me standing there, surrounded by the bustling energy of the festival. He saw Leo and Toby healthy, laughing and clinging to my hands. He saw the new glasses, the warm coats, the physical evidence of the care I provided that he had so callously neglected. He did not glare. He did not puff his chest or attempt to reassert dominance. He just stared, a hollow, devastating recognition passing over his face. He was looking at the daughter he had spent a lifetime dismissing, realizing she was the only one standing tall while his entire empire burned. He looked like a man waiting for a confrontation. He expected me to march over to gloat, to demand an apology, to deliver a fiery speech recounting his failures in front of the crowd. He was bracing for the final blow. But true power does not require a performance. Justice is not always a dramatic monologue delivered to a captive audience. Sometimes justice is simply walking away, leaving the abusers stranded in the prison they built for themselves. I held Gary's gaze for 3 seconds. I did not glare. I did not smile. I offered nothing. I broke the eye contact, turning my attention completely away from them. "Aunt Roz, can we get that one?" Toby tugged on my hand, pointing excitedly toward a vendor spinning a massive tub of blue cotton candy onto white paper cones. I looked down at Toby, his face flushed with the simple, pure joy of a crisp autumn afternoon. "Yes, Toby," I said, a genuine wide smile breaking across my face. "We can get the biggest one they have." I took Leo's hand, tightening my grip on Toby's, and we walked toward the vendor. We did not look back. We did not spare another thought for the 2 isolated, disgraced figures standing alone near the antique tractors. I bought a massive cone of spun sugar, handing it to the boys, their laughter ringing out as they tore into the sweet, sticky treat. The afternoon sun cast a warm golden light over the festival grounds, the bluegrass band launching into a fast-paced, lively tune. I was 46 years old. I lived in a modest house in Fort Smith. I worked long shifts at a family practice clinic. I was a single woman raising 2 young boys who needed a profound amount of patience and care. But as we walked through the crowded streets greeted by smiles and warm nods from the neighbors who had stood by us when the storm hit, I knew exactly what my life was worth. The fear was gone. The lifelong burden of earning a place in a toxic family was lifted, replaced by a fierce, protective peace that Gary Pruitt's money could never buy. I had diagnosed the disease, excised the rot, and built something beautiful from the wreckage. I was Rosalind Pruitt, and nobody signed my name but me. There is a profound spiritual truth hidden in the architecture of the American family. A house built on the shifting sands of public image will inevitably collapse, while a home anchored in the deep, quiet bedrock of integrity can weather any storm. When we look closely at the story of the Pruitt family, we are not just witnessing a dramatic tale of fraud and justice. We are looking into a mirror reflecting a quiet crisis in modern society. As a spiritual practitioner observing the current state of our culture, I see families everywhere grappling with the same fundamental illusion that destroyed Gary and Brenda. It is the dangerous belief that a pristine reputation, material wealth, and the outward performance of success are suitable substitutes for character honesty and emotional awareness. Let us look at Travis the Golden Child. In many traditional American families, there is an urge to protect our children from the sting of their own failures. We want to give them the world. But when Gary and Brenda shielded their son from every consequence, when they bought his way out of mistakes and handed him unearned rewards, they did not protect him. They spiritually starved him. By confusing love with the removal of accountability, they cultivated a man so detached from his own soul that he could trade the health and safety of his own children for a luxury boat and a designer watch. In our desperate rush to make sure our children succeed in the eyes of the community, we must ask ourselves, are we raising them to look good, or are we raising them to be good? Wisdom is not inherited. It is earned through the friction of making mistakes and making amends. If we deny our children that friction, we deny them their humanity. Then there is Rosalind, the scapegoat. The daughter pushed into the shadows because her quiet, steady nature did not serve the family's grandiose PR campaign. Yet it was in those shadows that Roz cultivated the very traits her family lacked: profound resilience, unwavering morality, and deep emotional awareness. Because she was not handed the world, she had to learn how to build her own. She became a healer not just in her profession as a nurse, but in her spirit. There is a vital lesson here for every parent. The child who challenges you, the child who doesn't perfectly fit the mold you envisioned, or the child who quietly observes from the background is often the one holding the moral compass of the family. We must practice the emotional awareness required to see our children for who they truly are, honoring their unique spirits, rather than forcing them into roles that serve our own egos. Fairness in a family does not mean loving everyone the exact same way. It means offering every child the honesty, respect, and boundaries they need to grow into adults of substance. True family responsibility is not about what the neighbors think of you. It is about what happens behind closed doors when the world stops watching. Are we teaching our children that a forged signature is acceptable if it protects the family name? Or are we teaching them that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is the only path to genuine peace? The Pruitts spent 50 years building an empire of lies, only to find themselves utterly isolated in a sprawling, empty mansion. Meanwhile, Roz, who walked away with nothing but the truth and a fierce love for her nephews, found herself surrounded by a vibrant, fiercely protective community. You reap exactly what you sow. If you plant deception and entitlement, you will harvest loneliness. If you plant compassion and integrity, you will harvest a life rich with authentic connection. As we navigate the complexities of raising the next generation, we must remember that our children are always watching us. They do not listen to our lectures. They absorb our actions. They see how we treat the vulnerable. They notice when we choose our ego over their well-being. If we want to raise resilient, morally grounded adults, we must first be courageous enough to practice that same honesty within ourselves. Stories like this one remind us why we must remain vigilant, not just in the world, but within the walls of our own homes. They force us to examine our own reflections and ask the hard questions about what we value most. If these explorations of truth, justice, and the delicate, powerful dynamics of family resonate with your own journey, I invite you to subscribe to the Blueberry Revenge channel. We share these narratives not just for the thrill of the story, but to heal, to reflect, and to find the courage to rewrite our own scripts. In the end, the legacy we leave behind is not measured in trust funds, country club memberships, or the polished perfection of a Sunday dinner. It is measured in the hearts of the people we leave behind. Look at the empty space where a family used to be, and look at the laughter of two young boys eating cotton candy with the aunt who saved them. We are all building something every day with every choice we make and every truth we tell or hide. When the autumn wind finally sweeps through your own life, stripping away the leaves of reputation and image, what will remain standing in the quiet?